At my sister's lavish wedding, surrounded by 200 guests in designer gowns and $1,000 suits, I sat alone in the back corner, invisible, unwanted, forgotten. When dinner was served, everyone received perfectly plated gourmet meals. Everyone except me. My mother approached with a plate of cold scraps and sneered loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "A useless child deserves leftovers." My sister, radiant in her $10,000 dress, laughed with her bridesmaids, pathetic, as always. The humiliation burned, but I'd endured worse. 28 years of being treated like I didn't belong in my own family. 28 years of being called worthless, stupid, a waste of space. I smiled politely, rose from my chair, and prepared to leave with whatever dignity I had left. That's when everything changed. The groom, this confident, successful man my sister had been bragging about for months, looked across the room and saw my face. His expression went from confusion to shock to absolute terror. "Boss, what are you doing here?" 200 guests fell silent. My mother's face drained of all color. My sister started trembling, because they were about to discover the truth I'd been hiding. The truth that would destroy their perfect little world and reveal who really held the power in this room. This is the story of how one family's cruelest moment became their ultimate downfall and my sweetest revenge. My name is Catherine Miller, though most people just call me Kate. I'm 28 years old, a woman who has built her own quiet life working as a senior marketing executive for a firm in the city. Outwardly, my days are filled with numbers, campaigns, and deadlines, but beneath that professional exterior lies a complicated history of family wounds that never quite healed. Tonight, those old wounds were about to be reopened in the most painful setting imaginable, my younger sister's wedding. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Willowcrest Hotel, the air itself seemed to shimmer with money and celebration. It was a 5-star venue, the sort of place that charged more for a floral centerpiece than some people paid in rent. The smell of roses, lilies, and gardenias hung thick in the air, layered over with perfume and champagne. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across a sea of satin and silk diamonds glittered at throats and wrists, and the sound of laughter rose above the string quartet tucked into the corner. It was the kind of event designed not just to celebrate love, but to display wealth and status. And yet, amid all this opulence there, I was quietly placed at a table tucked so far back in the corner it may as well have been in another room. I sat alone at that table, my place setting neat, but clearly secondary. The white linen cloth stretched smoothly beneath my fingers, yet the chair felt colder, harder, less welcoming than the plush seats near to the center. From where I sat, I could see the swirl of gowns worth thousands, tuxedos tailored to perfection, shoes polished to a mirror shine. Guests moved gracefully from table to table, clinking glasses and exchanging compliments, pausing now and then to acknowledge me with the kind of polite nod you give a stranger before quickly turning away. Not one person lingered to talk. Not one asked how I'd been. Not one pulled me into their circle of warmth and noise. It was as if I were a ghost in my own family's story, visible enough to be acknowledged, but never embraced. The suffocating feeling of alienation pressed heavier with each passing minute. Conversations buzzed around me, yet none of them included me. I caught fragments, old neighbors reminiscing, college friends recounting shared mischief, co-workers of the groom exchanging proud remarks about his bright future. Laughter rose and fell like waves, and still I sat anchored in silence, the outsider no one thought to draw in. I could almost feel the wall they built around me, invisible yet impenetrable, and I wondered if anyone noticed how deliberate it was, how carefully they had isolated me. At the center of it all stood my sister Emily, glowing as if she were the only light in the room. Her wedding gown, layers of silk and lace flowing like liquid moonlight, drew every eye. Guests crowded around her, showering her with praise, their smiles wide and approving. She moved among them effortlessly, her laughter ringing out like a bell, her posture regale, her beauty undeniable. In her presence, I faded further like a shadow cast into the farthest corner, half forgotten and unnecessary. For as long as I could remember, Emily had been the son of the family, and I had been expected to orbit quietly at a distance, unseen and uncelebrated. I watched her carefully, the way she accepted each compliment as if it were her due, the way she leaned toward Mother with conspiratorial whispers, the way her eyes occasionally flicked toward me in the corner with something sharper than mere indifference. I knew that look. It was the same one she'd worn since childhood, the look that said she had everything and I had nothing, and that was precisely the way she liked it. Around her, Mother preened, basking in the reflected glow of her favored child. Father hovered close by, smiling politely, saying little. It was a tableau I knew by heart, the chosen daughter triumphant, the parents proud, and me, the forgotten one left in the background. But tonight, I was not simply forgotten. Tonight, I was studying every movement, every interaction with eyes sharp as blades. I noticed the way certain guests fawned more over my parents than over Emily herself, eager to keep favor with the family. I caught the subtle tightening of Mother's jaw whenever someone mentioned the cost of the venue, a tell she had never mastered. I saw the flicker of unease in Father's expression when the groom's colleagues praised his rising career. Details others missed, I gathered silently, tucking them away as if preparing for something yet to come. Because I knew deep down that nights like this were not as perfect as they appeared. And I knew with equal certainty that I would not remain invisible forever. The hours stretched slowly as the reception unfolded. Toasts were made, champagne flutes raised silverware chimed against crystal. Guests moved in tides toward the dance floor, their gowns trailing like waves, their laughter bright and brittle. From my corner seat, I observed, I endured, I waited, each moment layered upon the years of silence and neglect I had already survived. But tonight there was a difference. Tonight I wasn't simply enduring. I was watching, calculating, holding myself ready. I traced the rim of my water glass with a steady hand, letting the hum of conversation wash over me without breaking my concentration. Every false smile, every dismissive glance, every careless word was another stitch in the tapestry I had been forced to wear my whole life. But I wasn't the same girl who had once sat crying in her room, wondering why her family couldn't love her the way they loved Emily. I had grown into a woman who knew how to bear the weight of isolation without breaking. More than that, I had grown into someone who knew how to turn the tables when the time was right. From the back corner I could see everything. And while no one cared to see me, that was their mistake. They had placed me in the shadows, but shadows are where truths live, where secrets breathe, where the unseen becomes powerful. I could feel it building in me as the night wore on, the sense that I was not simply an outcast here. I was a witness, and perhaps, just perhaps, the harbinger of something they had never imagined. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes steady, my heartbeat calm. Let them laugh, let them shine, let them believe their perfection was unassailable. I knew better. And as I sat there in silence, the hum of voices and clinking glasses fading into the background, I felt the faint stirrings of something inevitable. I did not yet know how it would unfold, or how swiftly, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I had no idea that tonight that corner seat would become the center of attention for the entire ballroom. The moment the servers began moving through the room with silver trays, the hum of conversation shifted toward anticipation. Plates gleamed under the chandeliers as they were set before the guests. Delicate towers of salmon, perfectly cooked beef, tenderloin vegetables, arranged like art on porcelain. The scent of truffle oil and rosemary floated through the air, mingling with the laughter that surrounded me. I sat quietly at my corner table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and waited for mine, though some part of me already knew what was coming. My chair was positioned in such a way that I could see Emily at the center of the room, her gown spilling like a waterfall around her. She was radiant as she leaned close to her bridesmaids, their giggles carrying across the dance floor. Every movement she made was met with admiration. Every glance drew another compliment. And then there was me, set apart, watching the parade of silver trays glide past my table as though I were invisible. When at last a figure approached, it was not a server in uniform, but my mother, her posture regal, her smile cold and calculated. She carried a plate that was not polished porcelain, but plain white ceramic, and instead of artful presentation, it held only scraps: a half-eaten roll, a slice of chicken with its skin torn off, a limp sprig of lettuce, wilting in a puddle of dressing. She set it down in front of me with a flourish that felt more like a performance than an act of service. Her voice rang clear enough for the nearest tables to hear each syllable dripping with disdain. "Useless children only get leftover food. Don't expect anything fancy." A ripple of laughter rose from someone nearby, the kind of uncomfortable chuckle people give when they know cruelty has just been disguised as humor. My mother's smile tightened, satisfied that her words had landed exactly as intended. She turned away before I could answer, not that I would have. There was nothing I could say in that moment that wouldn't make me appear smaller, weaker, more pathetic in their eyes. So I sat still, my fingers curling around the edge of the tablecloth, my jaw tightening until I thought my teeth might crack. The humiliation burned through me like fire, but I forced my face to remain calm, even pleasant, as though I hadn't heard a word. A few feet away, Emily caught sight of the exchange. Her lips curved into a smirk, and she leaned toward her bridesmaids, whispering just loudly enough for the words to carry. "Pathetic as always. Thank God today is my day." Their laughter followed, high-pitched and cruel, the kind of laughter that pricked at the back of my neck and reminded me of every schoolyard taunt I had endured growing up. The sting was sharper now, not because the words were new, but because they were so familiar. Emily had been rehearsing that line all her life. It was her favorite role to play the golden daughter basking in approval while I was cast as the family embarrassment. She wore it like a crown, and tonight it gleamed brighter than ever in the light of the chandeliers. My heart thudded in my chest, but my expression did not falter. I pressed my palms against my knees beneath the table, feeling the muscles in my arms strain as I clenched my fists tight. It took everything in me not to react, not to fling the plate of scraps back into my mother's face, or shout across the room at Emily. But rage would only prove them right. Rage would give them the satisfaction of watching me unravel, and I would not give them that. It was then that an elderly guest at the next table leaned toward another, his voice carrying easily in the hush that followed. He nodded in my direction, lips pursed in smug disapproval. "She's just here to freeload. What could she possibly contribute?" His companion tittered, covering her mouth with a bejeweled hand, but she didn't argue. None of them ever did. They had been fed the same story for years, a story crafted by my mother and perfected by Emily, that I was the weak one, the useless one, the one who never quite belonged. And they had believed it because it was easier to accept the lie than to see the truth standing right in front of them. I lowered my gaze to the plate before me, the scraps congealing into something unappetizing and cruel. My throat ached with the effort of swallowing down the shame of holding it inside where no one could see. I wanted to scream, to demand that they look at me, truly, look at me and see the woman I had become. But instead, I forced my breathing to slow in and out, steady and controlled. On the outside, I was calm, serene even. On the inside, I was a storm gathering strength. The conversations resumed around me, laughter returning in waves as though the little performance of my humiliation had been just another piece of entertainment for the evening. Plates clinked, glasses chimed, and I remained seated with my untouched scraps, a picture of composure. But beneath the tablecloth, my fists stayed tightly clenched, nails biting into the skin of my palms. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous kind of calm is the one forged in fire. Tonight, I was that calm. I lifted my chin, straightened my shoulders, and allowed myself a small, measured smile. Let them laugh. Let them sneer. Let them believe they had diminished me. They could not begin to imagine how wrong they were. But they had no idea that in just a few minutes I would give them a taste of the truth. I sat in silence, staring at the plate of scraps before me, my fists still tight in my lap. The humiliation burned hot in my chest, but I refused to let it show on my face. Instead, I lifted my chin, offering the room a mask of serenity I did not feel. The laughter, the sneers, the dismissive nods, all of it pressed down like a heavy hand, and I realized if I stayed one moment longer in that corner, they would have what they wanted, the image of me broken, diminished, defeated. I would not give them that satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed back my chair. The scrape of its legs against the marble floor was quiet, yet in my mind it sounded like a declaration. I rose to my feet, smoothing the skirt of my dress, my every movement careful and measured. I told myself I was simply leaving, retreating with what dignity I still possessed. My pulse hammered, but my steps were steady as I turned toward the exit, eyes fixed on the far doors. And then it happened. Across the room at the head table where Emily sat glowing in her gown beside her new husband, the groom's eyes met mine. At first his expression was blank, as though he wasn't entirely certain what he was seeing. Then recognition hit him with the force of a blow. His mouth parted. His eyes widened, and in a voice loud enough to cut through the hum of conversation, he gasped, "Boss, what are you doing here?" The word echoed heavy with disbelief, shattering the illusion that had cloaked me all night. Boss. In that instant, the air shifted, heads snapped in my direction, glasses were set down with sharp clinks, forks stilled in midair. A wave of whispers surged through the crowd, moving from table to table, quick as fire catching dry grass. I felt the weight of 200 eyes turning toward me, their laughter and easy chatter vanishing into stunned silence. The orchestra faltered notes trailing off uncertainly as the musicians too turned their heads. I stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. My name wasn't spoken, but the title he had given me carried more power than I could have summoned with 1,000 words. Boss. Not failure, not useless, not pathetic. Boss. The identity I had carried outside these walls, hidden from the people who had always looked down on me, had just been unveiled in the most dramatic way possible. Across the hall, I saw my mother's face drain of color. The proud, rigid mask she wore cracked in an instant, her lips parted as though she'd been struck dumb. Emily. My sister, who had laughed so freely only moments before, trembled visibly in her expensive gown. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something closer to fear. Her bridesmaids shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to look at her or at me, their practiced smiles faltering. In that frozen tableau, I felt the entire balance of power begin to tilt. Guests who had dismissed me all night now leaned toward one another, whispering frantically, questions darting between them. Did he say boss? Is she really? How could we not know? The words reached me in fragments, but the tone was unmistakable. Confusion, disbelief, dawning, realization. I stood taller beneath the scrutiny, allowing their eyes to rest on me, refusing to shrink as I had so many times before. The corner where I had been banished no longer mattered. I was standing in the center now, whether I had intended it or not. And for the first time all evening, I felt the heavy cloak of shame slide from my shoulders, replaced by something far more powerful, respect, or at least the beginning of it. The groom's chair scraped backward as he stood, his gaze still locked on me. The silence was so complete, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the table nearest mine. Emily grabbed his arm, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of his jacket, but he did not look at her. His eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear never left mine. In that moment, the carefully curated story my family had spun for decades unraveled thread by thread. All their whispered judgments, their sneering dismissals, their staged humiliations, they were collapsing in the face of one undeniable truth. The man Emily had paraded as her great prize, the man they had celebrated as a perfect match, knew me not as the sister to be pitied, but as the authority he answered to. The guests began to shift their bodies, angling toward me as though pulled by an invisible force. It was not just curiosity now, but recognition that something monumental had occurred. I saw it in their eyes, the calculation, the way they replayed every moment of the evening with new understanding. The woman in the corner was not the failure they had believed. She was someone else entirely. The tension in the room was palpable, pressing against the walls, tightening the air. My mother's hand twitched against the tablecloth, her carefully manicured fingers trembling. Emily's lips moved soundlessly, her composure crumbling as she realized what this revelation meant. They had tried to make me small, but in a single sentence the groom had undone their work. I did not speak. I did not need to. My silence spoke volumes, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room, giving everyone time to feel it, to absorb it. The shift was almost tangible, like watching a tide turn, sweeping away years of lies in a single pull. I stood straighter, shoulders squared, eyes calm and steady. The humiliated daughter was gone, and in her place stood a woman no one could ignore. The respect I had fought for, the recognition I had earned beyond these walls, was finally inevitably colliding with the family that had denied me. They had thought me powerless. They had been so very wrong. And that was only the first shock of the evening. The room was still buzzing with whispers, though no one dared speak above a murmur after the groom's stunned declaration. 200 pairs of eyes clung to me, waiting for an explanation, trying to piece together the puzzle of how the woman they thought they knew could hold such unexpected power. I stood beneath their scrutiny, calm and composed. But inside my thoughts traveled back to the night when everything had begun to change for me, long before any of them could have imagined who I would become. 10 years earlier, I was not the woman standing tall in a ballroom. I was a 19-year-old hospital aide working the night shift to pay my bills after my family had turned their backs. My world then was a constant cycle of changing bedpans, restocking supplies, and mopping floors in the quiet hours between emergencies. It was grueling, thankless work, but it kept a roof over my head and taught me the kind of endurance that would become my greatest weapon. One night, around 2 a.m, I was pushing a cart down a dim corridor when I noticed a figure slumped in a waiting chair, his face pale, his body unnaturally still. Dozens of staff and visitors had walked past him, too tired or too hurried to notice. But something about the angle of his head, the slackness in his jaw, caught my attention. I abandoned the cart and rushed to his side, recognizing the telltale signs of a stroke. His breathing was shallow, his left hand twitching weakly against the armrest. I shouted for help, my voice echoing down the hall, and began the basic protocols I had memorized during training. Nurses and doctors came running, and within moments the man was rushed into intensive care. Later, I was told that if I had waited even 5 more minutes, he might not have survived at all. At the time, he was just another patient, an elderly man in an expensive suit who had collapsed far from home. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his story. But a week later, when he returned to the hospital for follow-up care, he asked for me by name. He thanked me with a quiet dignity, his voice still rough from recovery, and pressed my hand with surprising strength. "You saved my life," he told me. "One day, I hope I can return the favor." I smiled politely, thinking it was just something grateful patients said. I couldn't have imagined how serious he was. His name was William Harrison, though at the time it meant nothing to me. I had no idea that he was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a billionaire whose business empire stretched across industries and continents. He didn't reveal that part of himself in our brief encounter. He let me walk away back to my duties with nothing more than a kind smile and a promise I quickly forgot. But Mr. Harrison did not forget me. In the months that followed, things began happening in my life that felt like miracles. An anonymous donor covered the tuition I had been struggling to pay, allowing me to continue my studies. A part-time internship opened up at a marketing firm, one I hadn't even applied for. But somehow my name was on the shortlist, and the position seemed almost designed for me. Small investments I made with the meager savings from my paychecks suddenly blossomed at just the right moment, turning a few $100s into a few thousand. At first I told myself it was luck, nothing more. I was young, desperate for hope, and I clung to the idea that maybe fate had finally decided to give me a break. But it wasn't fate. It was William Harrison. Years later, I discovered the truth after I saved his life. He began quietly watching over mine. He had a network of people who tracked talent, opportunity, and potential, and he directed them to open doors in front of me while keeping his own hand invisible. Every scholarship that bore no name, every employer who seemed strangely eager to hire me, every investment tip that landed in my path, all of it traced back to him. He never once demanded gratitude, never once stepped forward to take credit. He simply created the scaffolding on which I could build a future. Of course, scaffolding alone doesn't build a tower. I worked harder than anyone around me. I studied late into the night after finishing double shifts. I poured myself into every project, every task, every chance I was given, determined never to waste the opportunities that appeared in front of me. My determination was real, my talent hard-won, but his hidden support accelerated my rise in ways I could not have achieved alone. Where others stumbled, I had a net to catch me, invisible but strong. Where others faced locked doors, mine swung open just enough for me to slip through. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had carved a name for myself in an industry where few women, let alone women from broken families with no backing, were expected to thrive. I built teams, led campaigns, turned failing divisions into profit-generating powerhouses. And still, I believed I had done it all by sheer grit and chance. Only later did I learn about the man who had once slumped half dead in a hospital chair, the man who saw in me something worth investing in. Even now, standing in the glittering chaos of my sister's wedding with the groom's stunned words still hanging in the air, I felt the echo of that night a decade ago. Without Mr. Harrison, I might still have clawed my way upward, but not so quickly, not so decisively. He had been the unseen hand that tilted the scales not to give me unearned gifts, but to ensure I had the chance to prove what I was capable of. He gave me opportunities, but I built the results. Together, those two truths shaped the woman standing before this crowd, the woman my family never thought I could be. I glanced around the ballroom, my eyes lingering on the pale faces of my mother and sister. They had no idea of the history that had brought me here. No idea that the stranger I once saved had become my secret benefactor, the silent guardian who made their cruelty irrelevant. But what they didn't know was that he was not the only one with secrets. My story was tangled with theirs in ways they could not imagine, and the truth was only beginning to surface. But Mr. Harrison wasn't the only one hiding secrets in this story. When I thought of Mr. Harrison and the opportunities that had come my way, it was impossible not to remember where I had started, how low I had been before life shifted. The truth was, my strength was not born from fortune or favor, but from those first brutal years when I had nothing but myself to rely on. I turned 18 the summer after my sister's 17th birthday, and what should have been a time of cautious excitement stepping into adulthood, preparing for college, became the moment my family chose to sever me from even the smallest bit of security. They had long shown me where their loyalties lay, but until then there had been some financial support, however grudging. When I dared to voice aloud what everyone already knew, that Emily was treated as royalty while I was made to scrape by like a servant, my mother's response was swift and merciless. "If you can't be grateful for what little you get, you'll get nothing at all," she had hissed. Father said nothing. His silence the only contribution he ever seemed to make when my mother decided to punish me. And just like that, the small allowance that had kept me afloat vanished. I was 18, legally an adult, but with no family to fall back on and no money to cover even the basics. So I did the only thing I could. I worked. Not one job, not two, but 3, because survival required it. In the mornings before the sun rose, I tied my hair back, buttoned up a uniform that smelled faintly of grease and coffee, and served eggs and pancakes to customers who barely looked at me. I learned to move quickly, balancing plates up my arms, memorizing orders, swallowing my exhaustion behind a polite smile. By the time most people were arriving at their offices, I had already been on my feet for hours. When the lunch rush died down, I stripped off the uniform, tugged on sneakers, and switched to my second job, deliveries for a local pharmacy. I pedaled an old bicycle across town, rain or shine, dropping off prescriptions at cramped apartments and sprawling homes alike. Some people tipped with kindness, others with condescension, and many not at all. My legs burned, my back ached, but I kept going because I had no choice. Then, when evening fell and most of the world was settling in for dinner, I clocked in for my third job mopping floors and emptying trash bins in an office building downtown. The smell of industrial cleaner clung to my clothes as I scrubbed until my knuckles split. By midnight, I dragged myself home, slept a few hours, and woke to do it all again. I lived like that for years, every day a cycle of exhaustion. While Emily was chauffeured to cheer practice and later to her college prep courses, I was counting tips to see if I could afford both rent and groceries. When she got a brand new car for her 16th birthday, I was patching tires on a bike too old to shift gears smoothly. And when she was praised at family dinners for her beauty, her charm, her supposed brilliance, I was the punchline to their cruel jokes. Still slinging hash at the diner, my uncle would ask with a smirk. "You're wasting your life, Kate," my mother would declare loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Even education can't help someone like you." They said these things not in private whispers, but in public at gatherings where neighbors and distant relatives would nod along as though it were a fact, not an insult. Emily would laugh, shaking her head as though she pitied me, though her eyes always glittered with satisfaction. Those words stung deeper than the blisters on my hands or the aches in my bones. I carried them with me through every shift, every delivery, every late-night cleaning job. But I also refused to let them vanish into thin air. I began to write them down, each insult carefully recorded in a worn leather-bound diary I bought from a thrift store. It became my private ritual every night before collapsing into bed. I would recount the day's cruelties. The sentences etched themselves onto the page like scars. Mother called me useless again today. Emily said I'd never be more than a waitress. They told me I was wasting my time trying to study. It was painful to write, but it gave me a strange sense of control. On the page, their words were not weapons piercing my heart. They were evidence, a testament to what I had endured. In those pages, I documented more than their cruelty. I wrote about the nights I sat alone in my tiny rented room, eating instant noodles because it was all I could afford. I wrote about the customers who treated me like I was invisible, about the delivery routes that left my body trembling with exhaustion, about the office floors that gleamed under fluorescent light only because I scrubbed them raw. And I wrote about the small victories, too, the day I managed to pay rent without borrowing a dime. The professor who told me my essay was the best she had read in years. The stranger who pressed a $5 bill into my hand and said, "Keep going, kid. You're gonna make it." Those words, so rare and fleeting, meant more to me than anything my family had ever said. The diary grew thick with ink, its pages curling at the edges, and still I wrote. Some nights the tears blurred the words, but I kept the pen moving, because if I didn't, I feared I might forget who I was beneath their relentless belittling. I needed proof that I was more than what they told me, proof that I had survived every cruel word and kept moving forward anyway. That diary became my shield, the one place where I could tell myself the truth, even when the world around me was determined to deny it. Looking back now, those years were the crucible that shaped me. I did not crumble under the weight of 3 jobs, empty bank accounts, and constant humiliation. I hardened. I learned to endure, to fight, to keep going even when no one believed I could. I became resourceful, determined, unbreakable. Every plate I carried, every mile I pedaled, every floor I scrubbed added a layer of steel to my spine. They thought they were breaking me, but all they did was forge me into something stronger than they could have imagined. Those dark days forged me into someone who could never be defeated. Those dark days forged me, but they did not define me forever. What they gave me was the discipline to rise before dawn, the resilience to endure long nights, and the hunger to seize every opportunity, no matter how small. Step by step, shift by shift, I climbed from the life of exhaustion into one of ambition. What began as survival gradually became determination, and determination became vision. I refused to remain the girl my family had discarded. If they would not see my worth, then I would build a life so undeniable that the rest of the world could not look away. That life began with Harrison Enterprises. What started as an unexpected internship born of one of those invisible chances Mr. Harrison set in my path grew into a career that demanded every ounce of my focus. I was nobody then, a young woman with no pedigree, no family name worth mentioning, and no expectations trailing behind me. But I was relentless. I studied every detail of the business. I learned from failures without flinching. When others settled for meeting deadlines, I aimed to exceed them. It didn't take long before my superiors began to notice. Promotions came not from luck, but from an unshakable drive to prove that I belonged in every room I entered. By the time most of my peers were still finding their footing, I had already begun to command entire teams. Years passed and Harrison Enterprises grew. So did I. I accepted the sacrifices without complaint. Late nights, weekends at the office, relationships that withered under the weight of my ambition because I knew what I was building. Eventually, the day came when the boardroom doors opened and I walked through not as an employee, but as the one who would lead them. I became CEO of Harrison Enterprises, a company that controlled billions in revenue and held sway over markets across the country. The title was more than a position. It was proof. Proof that I had turned the life my family mocked into something extraordinary. Proof that the girl scraping plates in a diner now sat at the head of a table where powerful men once assumed she would never belong. Among those who worked for me, there was one man who stood out. Andrew the groom my sister had chosen. I knew him not as the polished figure standing at the altar, but as my marketing director, a man who had impressed me with his sharp instincts and tireless work ethic. Under my leadership, he had grown rapidly, always respectful, always eager to learn more. He never treated me with anything less than professional admiration, and he carried himself with the kind of humility that is rare in men climbing the corporate ladder. That was the Andrew. I knew the colleague who understood my expectations, who called me boss with sincerity, who recognized the standards I demanded and strived to meet them. To see him standing across the ballroom now recognizing me not as his bride's sister, but as the woman who signed his paychecks, was a moment heavy with irony my family could never have imagined. Outside the walls of this wedding, I was not invisible. In the industry, my name carried weight, even if it was not the one my family knew. I had taken on a professional name that bore no connection to them, a deliberate choice to separate the woman they ridiculed from the leader the world respected. Under that name, I became known as the Iron Lady. It was a title whispered in boardrooms and printed in trade magazines, not born from cruelty, but from respect. I was tough, yes, but fair. I demanded excellence, but I rewarded loyalty. I was not feared for pettiness, but admired for the precision and integrity I brought to every deal. Competitors respected me, partners trusted me, and employees who worked under me often said I was the hardest boss they ever had, but also the one they would follow without question. And yet, within my family, I remained the scapegoat, the disappointment, the invisible daughter seated in the shadows. They had no idea of the empire I commanded, no clue of the countless decisions I made that rippled across industries, no understanding that the sister they mocked was the same woman they unknowingly benefited from every time Harrison Enterprises' success strengthened the economy around them. They lived in ignorance because I allowed it. I kept my professional identity separate, not out of fear, but out of choice. They didn't deserve to share in my success. They had forfeited that right the day they turned their backs on me. But standing there in that glittering ballroom with Andrew's voice still hanging in the air and 200 guests staring in stunned silence, I knew the walls I had built between those two worlds were crumbling. My family's carefully crafted illusion that I was the useless one, the failure, the burden was about to collapse in front of an audience they had worked so hard to impress. They wanted me invisible, but the truth had a way of forcing itself into the light. The truth was that I had built more than a career. I had built a reputation so solid that even my sister's new husband could not hide his respect for me. I looked at Emily, then her hand still clutching Andrew's arm, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. I looked at my mother, her face pale and drawn, her lips pressed tightly together as if she could somehow undo what had already been spoken. In their eyes, I saw the first flicker of recognition, the first crack in the narrative they had clung to for so long. They had thought themselves victors in a story where I was forever the loser. But tonight, with every whisper spreading across the room, with every stunned glance that shifted from them to me, their story was unraveling. And now the whole world would know who the real failure was. The shock that rippled through the wedding hall when Andrew called me boss was only the beginning of the story. What no one in that room knew, not my mother with her rigid smile, not Emily with her trembling hands, not the curious guests whispering behind their napkins, was that the truth of our family ran deeper than the titles and positions they had just witnessed. My rise in business was one kind of revelation, but the investigation I had carried out years before had exposed something far darker, something that shook the very foundation of who we were as a family. It began during one of those sleepless nights that seemed endless when memories of my mother's cruelty and my sister's gloating laughter pressed too heavily on my chest to allow rest. I had built success by then, but the scars of the past would not let me go. I needed to understand why my family had treated me as they did, why Emily was forever exalted while I was cast aside. It couldn't simply be favoritism. There had to be something else beneath it, something hidden. My instincts told me that secrets lurked in the shadows of our family's history, and I could not find peace until I uncovered them. So I hired a private investigator. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Who pays a stranger to dig into their own family? But I had learned to trust my instincts in business, and those instincts had saved me more times than I could count. Weeks later, the investigator returned with a folder so thick it felt like a stone in my hands. He placed it on the table between us with a gravity that made my stomach twist. "What you're about to read," he said quietly, "will change everything you thought you knew." The first page was a copy of Emily's birth certificate, the same one I had seen framed once in my mother's desk. But the investigator pointed out the discrepancies, the typeface that didn't match the official documents of the year, the registrar's signature that had been traced from another form, the stamp that under scrutiny revealed itself to be nothing more than an ink transfer. It was a forgery, a carefully crafted lie that had held up only because no one had ever thought to question it. My mother had presented it as truth, but it was nothing more than a mask. Behind that mask lay the real records buried in dusty files that took months for the investigator to uncover. Emily was not born into our family. She had been adopted, her paperwork hidden, her true origins erased by my mother's deliberate hand. The trail led to another family, one that had lived 3 towns over, wealthy by any measure. They were comfortable landowners with investments that stretched across several states. But tragedy struck when both parents died in an accident, leaving behind an infant daughter and a fortune locked in trusts. That infant was Emily. The revelation made my blood run cold. My mother had not adopted her out of love or compassion. She had seen an opportunity. By taking Emily in by falsifying records to make her appear as though she were her own flesh and blood, my mother placed herself as gatekeeper to an inheritance that never belonged to her. She could present Emily as her daughter, raise her as such, and when the time came, manage her fortune as though it were part of our own family's estate. To the outside world, it looked like generosity, a grieving woman stepping in to raise a child who had lost everything. In truth, it was theft calculated and ruthless. As I turned page after page, piecing together the truth, I understood why my mother had always lavished Emily with gifts and praise. It wasn't just favoritism. Emily was her golden goose, her access to wealth and status. Every birthday party dripping in extravagance, every private lesson, every designer dress had been funded not by sacrifice, but by money siphoned from Emily's biological family. My mother had built her entire life on a foundation of deceit. And I, the true daughter by blood, had been pushed aside because I had nothing to offer her but the inheritance she had already stolen from me by diverting all attention to Emily. The investigator's report made it clear by law I was the legitimate biological child, the one with rightful claim to the Miller family estate. Emily, for all her posturing and privilege, had no true claim to it at all. The wealth, the property, the social standing, it was all mine by birthright. My mother had known this. She had buried it under lies, keeping me subdued and humiliated while she funneled resources toward Emily's charmed life. The rage that welled in me as I realized this truth was unlike anything I had felt before. For years I had believed I was somehow deficient, that I was to blame for being unwanted, that my lack of worth was inherent. But the truth was that I had been cast aside not because I was worthless, but because I was too great a threat to the empire my mother had built on deceit. The knowledge settled into me like fire and steel. My family had spent my entire life calling me nothing, but the documents in my hands proved the opposite. I was the heir. I was the rightful child. Emily's entire life had been constructed on lies, and my mother's cruelty toward me had been an elaborate act of misdirection. They had tried to erase me, to keep me silent, to convince me I was less. But I was more than they ever admitted, and the truth was now mine to wield. I closed the folder with trembling hands, my mind already racing with the implications. This secret was a weapon sharper than any insult they had ever thrown my way. But it was also a burden, for I knew that revealing it would shatter Emily's world as surely as it would expose my mother's corruption. As much as I hated them for what they had done to me, there was still a part of me that hesitated at the thought of unleashing this storm. Yet deep down I knew hesitation would not last. They had left me no choice. The night I learned the truth of the switched birth certificate, I understood my family for the first time. My mother was not just cruel, she was calculating, a thief cloaked in respectability. Emily was not my rival by nature, but by design a pawn in a game she never knew she was part of. And I was not the discarded daughter. I was the legitimate heir, the one who carried the true bloodline, the one who had been denied her rightful place. But that wasn't the biggest secret I uncovered. When I uncovered the truth about Emily's adoption and the false records my mother had created, my first instinct was to believe that my father must have been complicit. For years I had watched him sit silently at the dinner table as my mother cut me down with sharp words, as Emily flaunted her superiority, as the scales of our family tilted ever further against me. He rarely intervened, rarely defended me, and I grew up thinking of him as a weak man who lacked the courage to stand against my mother's cruelty. Yet as my investigation continued, another layer of truth surfaced, one that forced me to see him in an entirely different light. My father had not been silent out of indifference. His quiet had been deliberate, his passivity an act of protection I had never recognized. The revelation came to me not in dramatic fashion, but in the form of notarized papers unearthed by the same investigator who had delivered Emily's adoption file. Among the documents was a series of transfers carefully executed when I was 16 years old, long before I even understood what inheritance or assets meant. Piece by piece, property and holdings that should have been tied to my parents' estate had been quietly shifted into my name. It wasn't everything, but it was enough, a portfolio of land titles, bonds, and a modest trust that would be shielded from any attempt my mother might make to divert them elsewhere. At first I thought it must have been a mistake. Why would a man who rarely spoke to me, who allowed my mother to mock me in front of strangers, go to such lengths on my behalf? But the signatures were his, the witnesses credible, the transfers airtight. He had done it knowingly, methodically, as though preparing for a storm he knew would come. I remembered then the small, quiet moments I had dismissed in my youth. Times when he would slip into my room late at night after the shouting had died down and leave an extra blanket folded at the foot of my bed. The way he always made sure there was gas in my car when I first learned to drive, even though my mother complained that I wasn't worth the expense. How he never contradicted my mother's harsh words, but occasionally when her back was turned, his eyes would meet mine with something like apology. At the time, those glances felt hollow, cowardly. But now I wondered if they had been something else, an unspoken promise that he had not forgotten me, even if he could not say so aloud. The more I studied the documents, the clearer the pattern became. Every time he seemed to turn away from me, every moment when I thought he had abandoned me to my mother's scorn, he had been working quietly to build a wall of protection that even she could not breach. He had registered properties under my name when I was still a minor, ensuring that they could not be touched later without my consent. He had consulted attorneys signing papers behind closed doors, using his reputation as a man of business to hide his true intentions from his own wife. His weakness had been a mask concealing a strategy that stretched across years. I began to understand the impossible position he had been in. My mother was fierce ambitious in her cruelty, determined to elevate Emily at any cost. If he had openly defied her, she would have unleashed her wrath not only on him, but on me as well. By pretending to be powerless, he kept her eyes fixed elsewhere while he maneuvered in silence. The man I had dismissed as spineless was in truth a quiet tactician who endured her contempt to ensure my survival. That realization brought a complicated mix of emotions. I felt gratitude, of course, for the sacrifices he had made, but also sorrow for the years of distance between us. I wondered what it had cost him to watch me suffer, to hear my mother tear me down, and remain silent to see my tears, and know he could not comfort me without jeopardizing his plan. His silence had wounded me deeply, but now I realized it was the very thing that had secured my future. He had chosen to let me believe he was weak, so that my mother would never suspect his strength. It was a strange kind of love, one that wore the face of neglect. Yet love, it was undeniable in the ink of legal filings, and the foresight of a man who knew he would not always be there to protect me. I thought back to my 16th birthday, a day that had passed without celebration in our house. My mother had showered Emily with gifts the year before, but for me there had been nothing but a perfunctory happy birthday spoken without warmth. I had gone to bed feeling forgotten, convinced I was less than nothing. But now I knew that on that very day my father had been at a lawyer's office signing papers that would change the course of my life. While I cried into my pillow, he was ensuring that my future would not be stolen. The weight of that truth was almost unbearable. For years I had carried anger toward him, resentment for his silence. And though some of that anger remained because silence, even strategic, still allowed me to be wounded, it was tempered now by understanding. He had loved me in the only way he knew how, through careful planning, through quiet sacrifices that left him misunderstood. His weakness had been armor, his silence a shield. He had let the world, and even me, believe he was powerless, when in reality he was buying me time, securing my place, ensuring that one day I would be able to stand on my own without fear of losing everything. I closed the folder of documents with a shaking hand. My mind caught between past and present. My father's secret protection reframed my childhood, casting his every action in new light. I wished he had told me, wished he had given me even a fragment of hope during those long, lonely nights. But perhaps if he had, the plan would have unraveled. My mother's eyes were too sharp, her suspicions too quick. He had given me the only gift he could, security cloaked in apparent neglect. I thought I had finally reached the bottom of the well of secrets that defined my family. The truth of Emily's adoption, the falsified documents, my father's hidden strategy, all of it painted a picture of betrayal and sacrifice that stretched far deeper than I had ever guessed. But even as I absorbed this new understanding, I sensed that the story was not yet finished. There were still shadows left unexplored, still truths that waited to be revealed, truths that would cut far deeper than anything I had learned so far. But the deepest betrayal was yet to be revealed. The revelation of my father's quiet protection had shaken me, but even that paled beside what came next. For years I had believed my mother's cruelty was rooted only in favoritism, in the twisted pleasure she took in elevating Emily while grinding me down. But as the investigation into our family's history deepened, what emerged was not simply cruelty, it was crime. My mother had not merely lied, she had built an entire empire of deceit on the back of a stolen child and a stolen fortune. The investigator laid it out before me piece by piece, as though unwrapping a box of rot hidden beneath a pretty bow. Emily's adoption had not been a legal process filled with compassion as my mother once allowed others to believe. It had been a theft. When Emily's biological parents died in that accident, they left behind more than a child. They left behind land investments and a carefully designed trust to provide for their daughter's future. The money was substantial, meant to ensure that Emily would never want for security or opportunity. That money was supposed to be managed by court-appointed trustees, carefully overseen until Emily reached adulthood. But my mother had other plans. Through forged documents, she presented herself as Emily's natural mother, bypassing courts and processes, weaving a story that positioned her as the grieving widow who had to rebuild life with a daughter in tow. She didn't just forge one paper. She recreated an entire history, a birth certificate that placed Emily under her name adoption records with signatures that did not belong to the supposed witnesses' official stamps replicated by hand. She built a fiction so thorough that no one thought to challenge it. Why would they? A woman claiming to have lost a husband but spared her child drew only sympathy. No one questioned. No one suspected. While the world believed her to be a devoted single mother, she was systematically draining Emily's inheritance. The trust, the properties, the investments, all of it was siphoned away under her signature. She cloaked her theft in the language of motherhood. When she withdrew money from accounts, she called it school expenses or medical care. When she transferred land into her own name, she framed it as consolidation for family stability. The more I read, the sicker I felt. She had paraded her supposed sacrifice in front of friends and neighbors, basking in admiration for raising 2 daughters alone, when in reality she was a parasite feeding off the fortune of a child who never knew the truth. The cruelty of it was almost elegant in its ruthlessness. Emily was never more than a pawn, an unwitting tool my mother wielded to access what was never hers. Every birthday party glittering with excess, every designer gown, every vacation she boasted about was funded not from sacrifice, but from stolen wealth. And Emily, blind to the truth, wore that privilege like proof of her superiority, never knowing that she was being used as a shield for theft. The irony burned in me. She mocked me as worthless, while her entire life was financed by money that did not belong to her or to my mother. The paper trail was undeniable. Bank records showed consistent withdrawals far beyond any reasonable expense for a child. Properties that once bore the name of Emily's biological family were quietly signed over the signatures on the deeds, crude imitations of men and women already dead. Accountants' notes revealed discrepancies, ignored auditors' concerns, silenced with bribes. My mother had been careful, but no criminal is perfect. Over time, her arrogance left cracks. It was through those cracks that the truth poured out. The deeper I read, the more the anger in me grew, twisting from a dull ache into something sharper, something alive. This wasn't simply about me being treated as less. This was about lives destroyed, legacies stolen, a child stripped of her history and repackaged as a prop. My mother had worn the mask of respectability, smiling at neighbors, leading church committees, volunteering at school events, all while committing fraud on a scale that stretched across years. The thought of it made my skin crawl. And yet no one had seen her for what she was. No one but me now. I thought of the times she boasted to friends about her sacrifices, how she claimed she worked herself to the bone to provide for her daughters, how she looked down her nose at other parents, criticizing them for spoiling their children while she, in her words, raised strong girls. Her lies had won her admiration. Women envied her. Men praised her. And all the while she was funneling away money meant to give Emily a future built on her real parents' legacy. It was theft wrapped in a performance of maternal virtue. What stunned me most was the precision of her manipulation. She hadn't just stolen money, she had stolen identities, stolen stories. Emily grew up believing she was the favored daughter of a proud mother, but in truth she was an orphan raised by a thief. I had grown up believing I was lesser unworthy, but in truth, I was the only child who carried my parents' blood, the only rightful heir to what was left of our family name. My mother had inverted reality so completely that even I had fallen for it. And that was her true crime beyond the forged papers and illegal transfers. She had twisted truth until lies felt like air suffocating all of us. As I sat with the files spread out before me, I began to copy them page by page onto my own records. If there was one thing I had learned in my years of struggle, it was that evidence mattered more than emotion. I could not change the years of cruelty I had endured. I could not undo the life Emily had lived in ignorance. But I could make sure that when the time came when the truth needed to be told, there would be no doubt, no denial, no escape. Every bank statement, every forged signature, every deed transfer, I collected them all. I built my case like I once built my diary of insults, a testament not to what had been said, but to what had been done. The day I finished assembling the file, I sat in silence, staring at the stack of paper thick as a brick. It was more than evidence. It was justice waiting to be unleashed. My mother had spent decades weaving lies, but I had unraveled every strand and bound them together into something she could never refute. She thought her crimes buried beneath charm and pretense, but I had unearthed them, every last one, and I had documented every single crime. The file of my mother's crimes still weighed heavy in my memory, though the ballroom guests could not see the evidence I carried within me. They saw only the aftermath, the way Andrew's voice had cracked with shock when he called me boss, the way my mother's face had drained of color, the way Emily's hands trembled as though the floor beneath her had shifted. The silence that followed had been thick enough to choke on, but silence never lasts long in a room filled with 200 people trained by habit to gossip, to speculate, to feast on scandal, as though it were a second dessert. It began softly, a murmur at the nearest tables, the kind of whisper one might expect when an unexpected figure steps into a play and the audience tries to remember where they've seen her before. Did he say boss? Someone hissed the word, slithering across the space between tables. Another voice followed, curious and sharp. Is she really his boss? The questions multiplied, repeating like a broken refrain from one corner of the hall to the other. Guests leaned toward each other, napkins forgotten in their laps, glasses of champagne hovering untouched in their hands. Eyes darted between me, the groom, and my family with a hunger for answers that grew with every second of uncertainty. It wasn't long before the whispers deepened, drawing from memory, pulling threads of old stories into the present moment. You know, one woman murmured, her voice low, but clear enough for me to catch. I heard years ago that their family wasn't as perfect as they claimed. Another guest chimed in. Yes, I remember something about the older daughter. Didn't she work her way through school, always so quiet, while the younger one? Well, she liked attention. The words stung, but not for the reason they once would have. They stung because for the first time people were beginning to see what had always been true, that the golden image of my sister and mother was nothing but paint on cracked porcelain. The shift in energy was subtle at first, but I felt it like a change in the weather. The admiration that had once poured toward Emily and my mother began to falter. Smiles directed at them stiffened. Eyes that once glowed with approval narrowed with suspicion. Guests who had earlier laughed at my humiliation now looked uneasy, as though they sensed they had chosen the wrong side in a story whose ending might not favor them. The air carried a new current, and in that current I could feel the tide turning. I stood in the same spot where moments earlier I had been the object of ridicule, yet now every glance toward me was shaded with curiosity, even respect. They wondered who I was, what power I held, how I had managed to rise so far beyond the low expectations my mother had crafted for me. For so long I had been invisible in this family, but in that moment, invisibility was no longer possible. The weight of their stares pressed against me not with the cruelty of before, but with something else, recognition. Emily, sensing the change, tried to draw attention back to herself. She laughed nervously, the sound brittle and forced, and whispered something to her bridesmaids, but the bridesmaids no longer laughed with her. Their eyes kept flickering back to me, uncertainty written across their faces. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line as she tried to summon her old authority, but even she could not ignore the whispers that grew louder with each passing second. Her silence, once a weapon, now made her look guilty. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a quiet resolve. The sympathy of the crowd was not yet fully mine, but it was shifting, bending toward me like grass before the wind. It was not pity they could see from my posture, from the calm in my face, that I did not need pity. It was something closer to respect, the beginning of a collective realization that the woman they had dismissed was someone they might one day wish they had supported. The ballroom seemed to contract around me, the chandeliers glittering overhead like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Every whisper built on the last, until the room hummed with speculation. How could we not have known, all this time, she was someone important? Imagine being her boss. The questions carried weight heavy enough to unsettle even the most loyal of my mother's friends. I could see them shifting in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances, already recalculating their alliances. The careful social web my mother had spun for years was fraying thread by thread, and I stood at the center of the unraveling. For years, I had imagined moments of revenge, pictured confrontations where I shouted the truth until it rang through the air. But now I realized that silence could be more powerful than fury. I did not need to defend myself or explain. Every second I stood calmly under their gaze, every moment my mother and sister failed to counter the truth, the balance of perception shifted further in my favor. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was steady, undeniable. The tide was turning, and nothing my family could say would stop it. I let my eyes sweep the room, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement. I saw heads bow as I met their gaze, saw expressions soften with something approaching shame. People who had moments ago been complicit in my humiliation now looked away, unwilling to meet my eyes. The whispers continued, relentless, weaving a narrative they could not undo. It was no longer my mother's voice that set the tone of the evening, but the murmurs of guests reinterpreting everything they had ever known about us. And I, who had been silenced for so long, felt the power of being heard without even speaking a word. The weight of 2 decades of lies was beginning to crack under the pressure of truth, and though the moment was fragile, I felt its strength. For once, the current of the room carried me, not against me. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself, knowing this was only the beginning. Then an unexpected voice cut through the whispers. The unexpected voice that silenced the whispers belonged to Andrew. His chair scraped loudly against the marble floor as he stood, his face pale yet determined. All eyes turned to him again, but this time he wasn't looking at the guests or at Emily clutching desperately at his sleeve. He was looking only at me. For a long moment he seemed to struggle with words, his throat tight, his chest rising and falling with the weight of something he could no longer keep hidden. Then, with a steadying breath, he spoke. "You all deserve to know who she is, and who I am." The room stilled, the whispers dissolving into a tense silence. I felt my pulse quicken, but my face remained calm, unreadable. I knew what was coming, though the others did not. Andrew had always carried an air of quiet respect around me, more than simple professional courtesy. He had listened too intently in meetings, worked too hard to earn my approval, asked questions not just about strategy, but about integrity, about leadership. He had admired me, and I had sensed it. But now, before 200 guests and the family that had mocked me into the shadows, he was about to pull back the curtain entirely. My father, Andrew, began, his voice carrying across the hall. "Is William Harrison." Gasps rippled through the crowd at the name. Even those who knew nothing of corporate empires knew that name. The billionaire. The man whose influence reached every corner of the business world. And for years my father has told me that if I wanted to be worthy of leading one day, I had to earn it. He sent me into Harrison Enterprises not as his son, but as an ordinary employee to learn from the ground up. To learn under her. He lifted his hand and pointed unmistakably to me. The air seemed to shift again, heavy with disbelief. Guests who had been questioning whether I could truly be Andrew's boss now had their answer. Not only was I his superior at work, but I had been the one chosen by William Harrison himself to shape his son into a leader. "She is not just my boss." Andrew continued, his voice growing stronger. "She is the woman my father respects most in business. She is the one who taught me what it means to earn success, not inherit it. Everything I know I learned by working under her. I felt the weight of his words settle over the room. My mother's lips parted as though she might protest, but no sound came. Emily's grip on Andrew's arm tightened, her nails digging into his jacket, her eyes wide with panic. This was not the story she had wanted told on her wedding day. She wanted to be the radiant bride admired and envied with a husband whose success mirrored her own supposed superiority. Instead, that husband was standing before everyone declaring allegiance not to her, but to me. But Andrew wasn't finished. His voice faltered for only a moment before he pressed on each word, cutting through the silence like a blade. This engagement, this marriage, it was arranged between families. A strategic alliance, nothing more. And I agreed because I thought it was my duty. But I never loved her. His eyes flicked briefly to Emily, whose face twisted with humiliation, then returned to me. The truth is, from the moment I began working under you, I admired you. Not just for your brilliance, not just for your strength, but for your integrity. You've faced things most of us couldn't survive, and you rose higher than anyone ever expected. I saw that. I respected it. And I could never feel the same about anyone else. The ballroom erupted in whispers again, but these were different from before. They weren't curious murmurs. They were shocked, disbelieving exclamations. Some guests clutched their pearls. Others exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Emily swayed slightly where she stood, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. My mother looked as though she had been struck, her hand gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. For once, neither of them had control of the narrative. The spotlight that had been theirs for so long had shifted irrevocably, and they could do nothing to stop it. I watched Andrew carefully, my expression unreadable. His words were bold, but I knew the weight of the choice before him. He stood between two worlds, the obligations of family and social expectation and the pull of his conscience, his admiration, his truth. He had been raised to believe duty came before desire, that alliances mattered more than feelings. And yet here he was, speaking not as a pawn, but as a man determined to decide for himself. I could see the tremor in his hand, the tension in his jaw, but I could also see resolve. This was not a man playing a part. This was a man breaking free. I felt the tide of sympathy in the room shift even further in my direction. The guests who had once pitied me now looked at me with something else entirely, curiosity, even respect. They saw a woman who had been demeaned and diminished by her family only to rise high enough that William Harrison himself trusted her with his legacy. They saw a groom who, on what should have been the happiest day of his bride's life, could not keep silent about where his true admiration lay. Emily's voice finally broke through the murmur of the crowd, sharp and desperate. "You can't mean this," she hissed, her words carrying across the hall despite her attempt to keep them private. "You're humiliating me in front of everyone." But Andrew didn't turn to her. He didn't try to soothe or explain. His eyes remained fixed on me, his silence speaking louder than her protests. In that moment, I realized the balance of the evening had tipped completely. The guests no longer saw me as the unwanted daughter, the family embarrassment. They saw me as the axis on which the entire night now turned. Their loyalties, their admiration, even their future alliances would be shaped by what happened next. My mother and sister had wanted to bury me in humiliation, but instead their own stage had become my platform. And as Andrew stood there, the son of William Harrison, torn between obligation and truth, his next choice would decide far more than the fate of a marriage. It would decide the fate of every carefully constructed lie that had brought us here. The wedding was about to become something entirely different. The air in the ballroom felt heavy after Andrew's revelation, as if every chandelier, every glass, every pair of eyes had frozen in anticipation of what would happen next. Emily's protests still hung in the silence, brittle and desperate, but they were drowned out by the collective hush of 200 guests, trying to make sense of the spectacle before them. For years, I had been forced to endure my family's mockery and silence, always swallowing my words, always pretending indifference, while anger and pain gnawed at me from the inside. But tonight, with the truth cracking open their perfect facade, I knew silence was no longer an option. Tonight was my moment to speak. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished marble, each sound ringing louder than the orchestra that had long since stopped playing. My hand closed around the microphone resting on its stand near the band. The weight of it was solid grounding, as though it belonged there in my grip. I looked out over the sea of faces, some curious, some shocked, some already filled with dawning respect. And then, I turned my gaze toward the two women who had shaped my life with cruelty, my mother and my sister. You spent years teaching me that I was worthless. I began, my voice steady, cutting through the silence. You told anyone who would listen that I was a burden, a failure, someone to be pitied or ignored. And I believed you for a long time. I believed it when you cut me off at 18. I believed it when you laughed at me for working 3 jobs just to survive. I believed it when you told the world that I would never amount to anything. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room, and then I smiled, not with warmth, but with the certainty of someone who had already won. But you were wrong. My eyes locked on my mother, whose face had gone rigid, her lips pressed so tightly they looked bloodless. You, I said, pointing directly at her, built your life on lies. You paraded Emily around as your golden child while using me as your scapegoat, the convenient shadow that made her shine brighter. But the truth is that every insult, every humiliation, every scrap you tossed my way only forged me into someone stronger than you could ever imagine. While you plotted and schemed, I was building something real, something you will never touch. Gasps rippled through the guests, but I didn't look away. My focus remained sharp, my voice unwavering. I turned then to Emily, who stood trembling in her designer gown, her cheeks blotched with the humiliation of Andrew's rejection. And you, I said, my tone sharp as glass. You thought my suffering was entertainment. You laughed at my pain, mocked my hard work, and flaunted every privilege you never earned. You thought being handed everything made you superior. But here's the truth: without the lies propping you up, you are nothing. And tonight, everyone can finally see it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the guests shifting uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between me and the two women who had ruled this family with arrogance and deceit. Some of them looked ashamed, remembering how they had nodded along to my mother's stories, how they had turned a blind eye to my humiliation. Others looked fascinated, as if they were watching a play unfold, unable to look away from the clash of characters before them. I let the pause stretch, commanding the room with silence as much as with words. Then I raised my chin and continued. For 28 years you tried to convince me that I didn't belong, that I was lesser, that I would never succeed. But while you were busy tearing me down, I was rising. I worked harder than either of you have ever worked a day in your lives. I built a career, an empire, and respect that cannot be bought or forged. And now the world knows who I am. Not your victim, not your failure, not your afterthought. I am the woman you tried to erase, and I am still standing. The words rolled through me with a power I hadn't known I possessed. My chest felt lighter with every syllable, as though I were shedding years of weight I had carried in silence. I could see the effect on the crowd too, the way their eyes softened toward me, the way heads nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the truth I spoke. Even those who had once sided with my mother now seemed uncertain, caught between the lies they had accepted and the reality unfolding before them. I turned once more to my mother and sister, my voice lowering every word deliberate. This was supposed to be your night, a night to flaunt your success, your power, your illusions. But instead it has become the night your masks fall away. And make no mistake, this is only the beginning. The microphone trembled slightly in my hand, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. I felt as though every injustice, every cruel word, every sleepless night had led me here to this confrontation. For the first time, I wasn't the child in the corner, silent and ashamed. I was the one holding the room in the palm of my hand. I was the one in control. The guests remained hushed, their eyes wide, their breath held waiting to see what would happen next. The chandeliers glittered above me, but it was no longer Emily who glowed in her gown. It was me, lit not by jewels or lace, but by the undeniable truth of my survival and triumph. I took a final deep breath, my gaze sweeping across the crowd, and allowed a faint smile to curve my lips. And that, I said softly, each word resonating with steel, was only the opening act. The echo of my words still lingered in the air, the silence in the ballroom stretching taut as a wire. My mother sat, rigid fury burning in her eyes, but restrained by the weight of so many watching faces. Emily, though, was far less composed. She shook her head, muttering under her breath, her hands trembling against the silk of her gown. I could see it in her eyes, the desperation of someone who knew her pedestal was crumbling beneath her feet. And I knew it was time to reveal what she had hidden all these years, the secrets she never thought anyone would uncover. For so long, I began my voice measured, you all believed Emily was the star of this family, the perfect daughter, the brilliant student, the ambitious professional, the shining example of what success should look like. That was the image my mother wanted you to see, and Emily played her part beautifully. But images can be forged just like documents. And in Emily's case, they were. The murmurs began again, soft but sharp, as people leaned closer to one another. I kept my gaze locked on Emily, forcing her to meet my eyes. Those diplomas she flaunted, the degrees she claimed forgeries, created by her and funded by my mother's stolen money. She never graduated with honors. She barely lasted a semester before dropping out. Every certificate she waved in your faces was nothing more than ink on fraudulent paper. Emily's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand silencing her before a word escaped. And those jobs she bragged about, the impressive titles, the companies she supposedly thrived in lies. Every time she failed, and there were many, she covered it with excuses, with forged recommendation letters, with glowing references she wrote herself. She spun failures into stories of triumph, convinced you all that she was destined for greatness, when in truth she couldn't keep a position for more than a few months without everything falling apart. I saw the shock ripple through the guests, many of whom had once nodded in admiration at Emily's supposed accomplishments. Some of them had even introduced their children to her, hoping she might serve as an inspiration. Now those same people stared at her with disbelief, their faith cracking as easily as the glass of champagne flutes clutched in nervous hands. She didn't earn her lifestyle. I continued, each word sharp and deliberate. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the trips she boasted about, they weren't the result of hard work or talent. They were bought with money my mother siphoned from a dead family's estate. Blood money paraded as achievement. And Emily wore it like a crown, knowing all along she hadn't earned a single jewel. Emily shook her head violently, tears pooling in her eyes, but the room had already turned. I could hear snippets of whispers now, disbelief bleeding into disgust. I remember her bragging about Paris. Was that paid for? She never mentioned where she actually studied. I always wondered how someone so young had that much. I leaned closer into the microphone, my voice lowering but carrying farther in the hush. Every deception, every forged credential, every fabricated success was designed for one purpose: to maintain her position as the favored daughter, to keep me cast in shadow so that she could shine under a spotlight that was never hers to begin with. She thought if she built enough walls of lies, no one would ever question the foundation. But the truth has a way of breaking through no matter how thick the facade. Emily finally found her voice, though it cracked under the weight of panic. "You're lying!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. "You're jealous. You've always been jealous. None of this is true." She turned desperately to the guests, to her bridesmaids, to anyone who might come to her defense. But no one moved. No one rushed to comfort her. Even her friends avoided her gaze, their eyes wide with betrayal, realizing they too had been fooled. I stood calmly watching her unravel. "If I were lying," I said quietly, Why would I have proof? Gasps swept across the room again as I pulled a folder from my bag, the same one I had used to gather evidence against my mother. Letters with signatures that don't match, university records that contradict her claims, employment records showing termination after termination, bank statements funded by accounts that were never hers. Every lie she told I can prove. Emily's legs buckled slightly and she gripped the edge of the table for support. I could see the terror in her eyes now, the realization that the fortress she had built for herself was nothing more than sand, and I was the tide. She looked at our mother silently, pleading for rescue, but even my mother's mask was slipping. For the first time, she couldn't hide the flicker of panic that crossed her face. The guests no longer whispered, they stared openly, some shaking their heads, others exchanging glances of disbelief. Years of admiration for Emily dissolved in an instant, replaced with judgment, with anger, with the bitter taste of betrayal. The perfect image she had crafted was shattering in real time, each fragment catching the light of truth. I straightened the microphone firm in my hand. So here we are. Emily, the flawless daughter, revealed as nothing more than a fraud propped up by theft, deception, and arrogance. You wanted me to be the failure of this family, the embarrassment. But tonight, everyone can see the truth. The embarrassment has never been me, it's been you all along. Emily let out a strangled sob, her makeup streaking down her face, her once perfect gown now trembling with every movement of her unsteady frame. The ballroom watched as the golden child crumbled, her lies collapsing like a house built on rotten beams. But her house of lies was about to collapse completely. The sight of Emily collapsing beneath the weight of her own lies left the ballroom in stunned silence, but I knew the unraveling wasn't finished. Exposing her fraud was only the first crack in the foundation. What came next would bring the entire house down. For years, my mother and sister had strutted through life believing they stood on solid ground, certain that wealth, reputation, and inheritance were theirs by right. They had mocked me, discarded me, all the while confident that when the time came, the family's fortune would rest securely in their hands. They never suspected that the future they imagined had been rewritten long ago, quietly, permanently, and in my favor. I lifted the folder again, letting it rest against my hand as I spoke. You all might think that Emily's lies are the end of this story, but they're not. Because this isn't only about fake diplomas and stolen opportunities. This is about everything my family believed they owned, everything they thought would one day belong to them. My voice echoed across the ballroom, steady and unyielding. The truth is, it already belongs to me. Gasps rose like a wave rippling across the sea of guests. I saw heads snap toward one another, eyes widening, mouths parting in disbelief. My mother's face hardened, but there was a flicker there, just a flicker of something else. Fear. My father, I continued, was not the weak, passive man you all assumed. He saw through the cruelty, the favoritism, the lies. And while he stayed silent, he was not idle. Years ago, he made legal transfers, properties, accounts, investments. One by one, he moved them out of my parents' names and into mine. Quietly. Permanently. By the time I turned 16, the majority of our family's wealth no longer belonged to them, it belonged to me. The air seemed to vanish from the room. My words landed with the weight of iron. My mother's hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Emily's tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, that's not true. But it was true, and I had proof. I held up a set of documents, the legal filings my father had carefully executed years before. Deeds in my name, bonds secured for my future, accounts transferred with signatures witnessed and verified, all done within the law. Everything you thought was yours, every home, every account, every penny, you lost it before you even realized. Murmurs broke out among the extended family, cousins, and distant relatives who had once aligned themselves with my mother, confident that their loyalty would pay off when the inheritance was divided. I saw the dawning horror on their faces as they realized there would be nothing left for them. They had bet on the wrong horse, and now they stood on the wrong side of history. I let the silence stretch before I delivered the next blow. And it doesn't stop there. The money my mother siphoned from Emily's biological family, the estate she drained under the guise of raising an orphan, by law that too belongs to me. Because I am the only legitimate heir by blood. Not Emily, not my mother, me. Every dollar she stole, every property she seized, every account she drained, it all comes back to me. The ballroom erupted. Voices overlapped, some outraged, some stunned, some whispering my name as though they were speaking it for the first time. My mother slammed her hand against the table. "Lies," she snapped, her voice breaking under the strain. "All lies. You forged those documents, you—" She stopped herself, realizing, even as she spoke, that the accusation sounded desperate. She had no evidence to counter mine. She had only fury, and fury could not rewrite the law. Emily's sobs grew louder, broken words spilling from her lips. "It's not fair. It's supposed to be mine. It was always supposed to be mine." She clutched at her dress as though the fabric itself might shield her from the truth. But there was no hiding from it now. The guests were no longer looking at her with sympathy. They looked at her with disdain, with disbelief, that they had once envied a woman who had built her life on lies and stolen wealth. I straightened my voice, clear, resonant. "You thought I was the afterthought, the forgotten child, the one with nothing. But the reality is, I am the rightful heir. I hold the deeds, the accounts, the signatures, the law itself. You spent years trying to erase me, but in the end, you erased yourselves. Everything you thought you had, everything you used to prop up your lies, it was never yours to begin with." The silence that followed was almost reverent. The guests stared at me not as the outcast in the corner, but as the woman who now held the power to decide the fate of everyone in the room. I could feel the shift, the weight of respect and fear mingling in their eyes. For so long they had dismissed me, ignored me, pitied me. Now they saw me for what I truly was, the woman who had already won. I looked directly at my mother, letting the words land like a hammer blow. "You told me once that I was nothing, that I would never stand on equal ground with Emily. But now you see the truth. Without me, you have nothing. Without me, you are nothing. And the day you mocked me for eating scraps at your table, you should have remembered one day you would be the ones left begging." Her face crumpled, rage and fear warring within her, but she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I lowered the documents, my hand steady, my voice unwavering. "You spent your lives convincing the world that I was the weak one, the useless one. But tonight, every person here has seen the truth. You don't own me. You don't own anything. And from this moment forward, you never will again." The ballroom was silent again, but this silence was different. It was not disbelief, not gossip. It was acknowledgement. The tide had fully turned, and there was no going back. My mother and sister, once untouchable, were exposed as penniless frauds in front of everyone they had sought to impress. I let the moment stretch, then added softly but clearly enough for all to hear. They needed me more than they ever imagined. The room was still vibrating with the shock of my last words when Andrew stepped forward. His face, usually so composed, carried the weight of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the only way forward was to jump. The silence in the ballroom pressed around him, every eye fixed on his figure, waiting for him to either retreat into safety or rise into something braver. I had seen him make difficult choices in the boardroom, but this was not business. This was his life, his future, his name, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. He cleared his throat, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. "I can't do this," he said at last, his voice steady but heavy with finality. The words rang out like a gunshot. The guests stiffened, the weight of them settling into the room like smoke. Emily turned toward him, eyes wide, her face streaked with the remnants of ruined makeup. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Andrew looked at her, and though there was pity in his eyes, there was no hesitation. "I'm saying I can't marry you. Not like this. Not when everything about this union has been built on lies." The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled across the hall, whispers exploding into incredulous murmurs. Emily's knees buckled and she clutched the edge of the table, searching for stability where none could be found. My mother reached for her, but Andrew's voice cut through the chaos again. "I can't be part of a family that thrives on deceit," he continued, each word gaining strength. "I have spent years watching from the inside, respecting a woman who built herself from nothing while being ridiculed by her own blood. I've seen her lead with strength, with fairness, with integrity. And in the process, I realized I couldn't ignore the truth. She is the one worthy of respect, not the ones who tried to bury her." I felt the eyes of the guests shift toward me again, but I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what was unfolding. Andrew wasn't simply walking away from Emily, he was declaring in front of 200 witnesses that truth mattered more than appearances, that my worth had never needed validation from anyone else, least of all the family who had tried to erase me. Emily's voice rose in a shriek, desperate and panicked. "You can't do this to me. Not here, not in front of everyone." She gripped his arm, nails digging into his sleeve, her once perfect composure shattered into raw desperation. "We're supposed to be married. Andrew, you promised." His gaze dropped to her hand, then lifted back to her face, calm but unyielding. "I promise to honor truth and integrity, not lies. And I will not spend my life pretending to love someone I never loved, tied to a family I cannot respect. I choose honesty. I choose freedom. I choose what's right." The murmurs grew louder, some guests nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The orchestra musicians, who had long since abandoned their instruments, stood frozen in shock, their bows and trumpets hanging limp at their sides. Even the waitstaff hovered in the corners, eyes wide, as though they too understood they were witnessing something unforgettable. Emily crumbled against his chest, sobbing hysterically. "Please don't leave me like this," she begged, her voice muffled by tears. "Don't humiliate me in front of everyone. We can fix it, we can make it right." "But—" Andrew gently took her shoulders and stepped back, breaking her grip. "This isn't humiliation, Emily. This is truth. And truth has a way of coming out whether you want it to or not. You've built your life on deception, and I can't be a part of it. Not now, not ever." My mother's face turned crimson with rage as she rose to her feet. "How dare you humiliate my daughter in front of our family, our friends?" She spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to her?" Andrew turned to her, his tone firm but respectful. "What I'm doing is refusing to carry the burden of your lies. This marriage was never about love. It was about power, appearances, and manipulation. And I won't be shackled to it." The room erupted again, voices overlapping in chaos, some siding with my mother's outrage, others whispering their admiration for Andrew's courage. Emily collapsed to her knees, her sobs echoing off the marble floor, her hands covering her face as though she could hide from the ruin of everything she had built. I watched it all with a steady calm, knowing this was the inevitable consequence of years of deceit. Andrew's stand wasn't just about me, or even about Emily. It was about truth finally breaking through the walls that had kept it out for so long. And though Emily wept as though her life were ending, I knew this was only the beginning. Andrew placed the microphone back on the stand, his voice carrying one final message as he stepped away from the altar. "I choose to walk away with my conscience intact, rather than stay and live a lie. And that is something I will never regret." The guests fell silent again, staring at Emily crumpled on the floor, her white gown pooling around her like ashes. The golden child, the envied bride, the woman who had always been held up as untouchable, now lay broken in front of everyone she had ever sought to impress. But her humiliation was far from over. My mother had always been the kind of woman who carried herself as if the world owed her obedience. Even when she lied, even when she twisted reality to suit her needs, she did it with such force that people bent under her will rather than challenge her. But tonight was different. Tonight I watched as her carefully constructed world cracked open, and in the chaos of her daughter's collapse, she finally turned her fury on me. She moved through the crowd like a storm, her gown brushing against chairs as she shoved her way toward me. Her face was tight with rage, her eyes wild, but beneath the fire I caught a flicker of something I had never seen before: panic. She grabbed my arm with a force that would have left bruises in the past and hissed through clenched teeth. "You've destroyed everything. Everything I built. Everything I fought for. You've torn it to pieces." I stood tall, unmoving. "No," I said evenly, my voice loud enough for those nearest to hear, though it was meant for her alone. "I didn't destroy anything. You destroyed it yourself. I'm only the one holding up the evidence." Her grip tightened, nails pressing into my skin. Lies she spat, though her voice cracked on the word. "You're nothing but a bitter, jealous girl who wanted revenge. You've ruined your sister's life, humiliated me, disgraced this family. Do you realize what you've done?" I looked her squarely in the eye, refusing to flinch. "I've done nothing but reveal the truth. And you're right, it is disgraceful. But not for me. For you. For Emily. For every crime you committed, every lie you fed to keep your throne intact. You want to talk about destruction. Let's talk about forged papers, illegal transfers, estates. You siphoned dry inheritances. You stole. Do you want me to list the bank account numbers? Or should I start with the properties you signed into your own name with signatures that didn't belong to you?" Her mouth fell open, a sharp intake of breath betraying her composure. She had always relied on intimidation, on her ability to make others doubt themselves. But now it was her footing that slipped, her certainty faltering under the weight of facts she could no longer deny. "You don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, my tone sharpening. "Every paper, every transaction, every forged document, I have it all. You thought no one would ever find it, but I did. You thought no one would challenge you, but I am. And the truth is written in signatures and bank records that don't lie." Her hand trembled on my arm, and for the first time I saw the power drain from her eyes. She pulled back slightly, her lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. The crowd had begun to notice us, their attention shifting from Emily's sobbing figure to the confrontation unfolding between mother and daughter. My mother, once the commanding figure at the center of every gathering, now stood cornered, her authority unraveling thread by thread. "You don't understand," she said at last, her voice weaker, almost pleading. "Everything I did, it was for us. For this family. To secure Emily's future. To make sure we never had to worry about money, about status, about anything. I carried this burden so you wouldn't have to." The audacity of her words made me laugh, a cold, sharp sound that silenced those who had drawn closer. "For us," I repeated, my voice like ice. "You call it sacrifice, but it was theft. You call it love, but it was greed. You didn't do this for us. You did it for yourself, for the image you wanted the world to see. You used Emily as a shield, as a tool, and you left me to rot in the corner so no one would notice what you were doing. Don't stand here and pretend this was about protecting me." Her eyes glistened, though whether from anger or something else I couldn't yet tell. Her mouth opened again, but I cut her off. "You should know one more thing. Every cent you stole, every property you claimed, every asset you drained, it's not yours. It never was. By law, I am the rightful heir. Every piece of wealth you paraded as your own has been mine for years. My father made sure of it. So when you talk about destruction, remember this. You've been living in a house that was never yours to begin with. And tonight, the world finally knows." Her body seemed to sag under the words. The steel in her spine bent. The fury in her expression wavered, and something else seeped in, fear raw and unmasked. She shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this. Don't take everything away from me." The shift was jarring. This was the woman who had once sneered at me in front of guests, who had laughed as she handed me scraps, who had delighted in my humiliation. Now she stood before me with her shoulders hunched, her voice low, her words slipping into desperation. "I can fix this," she stammered. "I'll make it right. Just don't destroy me." I stared at her, the woman who had controlled my every moment of pain for nearly 3 decades, and for the first time in my life I saw her stripped of her armor. No manipulation, no false pride, no venomous laugh, only fear. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and she knew it. The mother who had once forced me into silence was now the one begging to be spared. "I'm not the one destroying you," I said quietly, my voice firm. "You've done that yourself. You built your empire on lies, and now it's crumbling. You begged for respect but never earned it. You demanded loyalty but never gave it. And now, when the truth is finally here, you expect mercy. You never gave me mercy. You never gave me anything." Her knees bent slightly, her hand reaching out as though she might grab my arm again, but I stepped back. She faltered her strength, slipping away, her body swaying as if she might collapse like Emily had before her. Her lips trembled once more, and she whispered words I never thought I would hear from her. "Please, forgive me." The room seemed to stop breathing. My mother, the Iron Woman who had controlled every narrative, every conversation, every cruel insult, had just begged for forgiveness. And she begged it from me. For the first time in her life, she lowered her voice to me. My mother's whispered plea still hung in the air, fragile and unbelievable, when Emily's shriek sliced through the ballroom like shattered glass. She shoved herself upright, her face red and blotchy, streaked with tears and smeared makeup, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You've been jealous since childhood," she screamed, her voice hoarse from crying but shrill with desperation. "That's all this is. You've always hated me, always envied me because I was the one everyone loved. You can't stand that. I was smarter, prettier, better than you." Her words cracked like a whip, but the crowd didn't flinch. Not a single guest rushed to comfort her or nod in agreement. Instead, they stood frozen, watching as the golden child they once admired unraveled in front of them. Emily's chest heaved, her voice climbing higher with each accusation, as if volume alone might drown out the truth I had laid bare. "You're lying about everything," she shouted, her arms flailing as she turned in frantic circles, searching the sea of faces for a supporter. "She's twisted this whole night to make me look bad. Don't you see it? She's manipulating all of you, just like she's been manipulating Andrew and our father. She's nothing but a bitter failure who finally found a way to drag me down with her." The silence that followed her tirade was more damning than any rebuttal I could have spoken. 200 guests stared back at her with blank expressions, their eyes filled not with sympathy, but with quiet judgment. I saw it in their faces, the shift that had already taken place. They no longer believed her. They no longer saw her as the radiant bride or the perfect daughter. They saw her as a desperate woman clawing at the edges of a world she could no longer control. She stamped her foot like a child denied a toy, her voice cracking. "Say something," she demanded, her gaze sweeping frantically across the crowd. "Tell her she's wrong. Tell her you don't believe her lies." But no one answered. Not one of her bridesmaids, not one of the relatives who had always favored her, not one of the family friends who had cooed over her successes. Their silence was absolute, a verdict delivered without words. The harder she tried to rally them, the more pathetic she appeared. "She's jealous," she cried again, her sobs punctuating every word. "She's always been jealous. She can't stand that I had everything she didn't. She can't stand that I was loved and she wasn't." Her voice cracked completely on the last word. Her knees buckling as she clutched at the edge of a chair to steady herself. I stood still, watching her unravel. I didn't need to say a word. Every accusation, every desperate plea only drove the wedge deeper between her and the guests who had once adored her. They watched with wide eyes and pursed lips, unwilling to step into the storm she was creating. Her hysteria no longer evoked pity, it exposed her as delusional, out of touch with reality. One older guest near the front whispered to her companion loud enough for me to hear, "She's lost her mind." Another shook his head slowly, muttering, "We believed in her. We believed all of it." Their words carried like echoes, feeding the growing realization that Emily's perfect image had not only fractured but crumbled entirely. Emily spun back toward me, her hair disheveled, her dress wrinkled and damp from her own tears. "You don't deserve any of this," she shrieked, jabbing a finger toward me. "You don't deserve the money, the respect, the power. It should have been mine. All of it. Everyone knows I was supposed to have it. Everyone knows I was meant to be the one." Her voice cracked again, breaking into sobs that rattled her frame. She collapsed against the table, her shoulders shaking, still trying to summon some fragment of authority she no longer possessed. "She tricked all of you," she wailed, her voice hoarse. "You'll see. You'll all see. She's nothing but a fraud." But the irony was unbearable. It wasn't me who had fabricated degrees and jobs. It wasn't me who had lived off stolen wealth. It wasn't me who had wrapped my life in a glittering lie. It was her, and everyone knew it now. The silence of the crowd was like a mirror reflecting her madness back at her. No one moved to console her. No one spoke up in her defense. She stood utterly alone, stripped of the adoration she had always assumed would be hers, facing the truth she could no longer bury. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for even one sympathetic face. Finding none, she let out a strangled sob, her voice turning brittle with despair. "You're all fools," she spat, though the venom rang hollow. "You're all letting her trick you. Don't think she's some saint. She's been jealous of me since we were children. She's hated me her entire life. That's all this is, hatred." The guests remained silent, their expressions hard, their judgment clear. Emily's words no longer carried weight. They fell flat, echoing into the void her lies had created. The harder she fought, the deeper she sank into the quicksand of her own delusion. I simply stood there, my calm presence only highlighting the chaos of her unraveling. For years she had been the star, the one bathed in light, while I lingered in the shadows. Now the roles had reversed completely, and she could not bear the darkness pressing in on her. Her screams grew more frantic, less coherent. "You'll regret this," she shouted, though her voice broke halfway through. "You'll all regret siding with her. She's nothing. She's always been nothing." She clutched at her gown, her body trembling, her words dissolving into sobs that carried no strength, no dignity, no truth. The room remained unmoved. 200 pairs of eyes bore down on her, unblinking, unyielding. She had wanted to rally them to her side, but all she had done was reveal herself as pitiful, and lost a child screaming in the ruins of her broken stage. And then, as the sound of her sobs filled the silence she could no longer control, it happened. Then a voice rang out, silencing her forever. Andrew's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady, carrying the kind of authority that could not be ignored. Emily froze mid-sob, her wild eyes snapping to him as though he were her last hope, but I already knew her desperation was misplaced. His gaze was not the gaze of a man about to rescue her. It was the gaze of a man about to deliver the final blow. "I can't stay silent anymore," he said, turning to face the crowd. His voice carried across the ballroom, commanding every ear. "For too long I've listened to Emily's stories about her achievements, her supposed brilliance, her successes. I've nodded along while she painted herself as someone she never was. And now, with all of you here to witness it, I need to tell the truth." The murmurs of the guests quieted, anticipation filling the air. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Andrew's eyes swept the room before finally settling on me, his expression steady, respectful. "From the moment I met her," he said, gesturing toward me, "I saw what true strength looks like. She was the one who guided me when I was lost. She was the one who taught me what it meant to stand firm, to fight for what's right, to lead with integrity. Every success I've had in my career came because she was there mentoring me, challenging me, showing me what real leadership looks like." Emily shook her head violently, her voice breaking in a hoarse cry. "Lies! You're lying to protect her." None of that happened. But Andrew ignored her, his voice unwavering. When I struggled with the Harrison account, she was the one who spent long nights helping me draft proposals. When I nearly lost my biggest client, she was the one who stood beside me in that boardroom, her words saving a deal I had fumbled. She never took credit, never asked for recognition, but she was the reason I succeeded. And all the while, Emily was telling me stories about her own accomplishments, stories that never matched reality. She claimed promotions she never earned, jobs she never kept, accolades she never received. I kept quiet out of loyalty, but tonight I will not let lies overshadow truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a heavy silence. Every pair of eyes shifted back to Emily, who stood trembling, her denial now looking even weaker against the certainty in Andrew's voice. She tried to speak again, but her words dissolved into incoherent protests, drowned out by the weight of his testimony. Andrew turned back to the guests. You deserve to know who she really is. Every time Emily boasted about success, it was a story built on sand. Every time she flaunted her wealth, it came from theft, not work. And every time she tried to belittle her sister, she did it to distract from the fact that she herself had nothing real to offer. His voice softened slightly as he glanced at me again. Meanwhile, the woman you all dismissed, the one who was treated like she didn't belong, was the one who carried the weight of honesty, hard work, and strength. The applause began softly, a single pair of hands clapping from the back of the room, hesitant but firm. Then another joined, and another, until the sound swelled into a roar of approval that filled the hall. Guests rose to their feet, their faces no longer skeptical but moved with admiration and relief that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. The sound washed over me, not as a celebration of victory, but as recognition of justice long denied. Emily stumbled backward, her face pale, her lips trembling as she tried to shout above the applause. "Stop it! Stop clapping! You don't understand, he's lying! She's tricked him just like she's tricked all of you!" Her words fell flat, drowned out by the sound of hands striking together, by the collective voice of 200 people, declaring without words that they no longer believed her. My mother slumped in her chair, her earlier fury now dulled into stunned silence. For the first time in her life, she looked small, as though the weight of the truth had crushed the arrogance that had always carried her. Andrew's voice rose above the applause, final and resolute. This wedding was meant to be a celebration of love, of family, of unity. Instead, it became a stage for lies, manipulation, and greed. But no longer. Tonight, the truth has spoken. Tonight, the real verdict has been delivered, not by a court, not by a lawyer, but by all of us here together. And we see clearly now who stands on the side of honesty, and who has built their life on deception. The applause surged again, louder than before, echoing through the marble hall like thunder. Emily sank into a chair, her body trembling, her face buried in her hands, utterly alone in the sea of judgment. I stood still, absorbing it all. The applause, the shifting tides, the justice that had been denied me for so long, but had finally come crashing down with undeniable force. It wasn't about triumph. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth finally being recognized in the place where I had once been silenced, humiliated, and forgotten. The hall no longer felt like a wedding venue. The flowers, the champagne, the glittering chandeliers, they were all background noise now. The real event was what had just unfolded, the unraveling of a lie and the birth of truth in its place. The wedding had become a court of public opinion. The applause still echoed in the chandeliered ceiling when the room finally began to breathe again. The orchestra stood mute, the servers frozen at the perimeter with trays. They no longer dared to lift the guests, suspended between pity and relief, as if they had just watched a storm pass and were waiting to see what damage it had left behind. Emily sat crumpled, my mother rigid and gray, and Andrew stepped back from the microphone with the steadiness of someone who had said everything he needed to say. In that hush, I felt a presence at my shoulder, faint, hesitant, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten before I even turned. My father. His voice arrived first, a raw whisper that didn't belong to the man who had worn silence like a suit for most of my life. "Katie," he said, the old nickname catching like a thorn. "Please." When I faced him, I saw the tremor in his jaw, the sheen in his eyes, the way his hands shook as though they no longer remembered how to be still. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, as if years had dropped onto him all at once. He tilted his head toward a side corridor, and though I didn't owe him privacy, I allowed it. We stepped away from the crowd just far enough that the hum of the ballroom faded to a muffled tide. He tried to speak, and failed. The first sound was not a word, but a stifled sob shockingly human, and then the second came out broken. "I am so sorry." He rubbed his face like a man washing at a sink that wasn't there, struggling to assemble himself. "I should have said it sooner. I should have said so many things sooner." He faltered, swallowed, and the tears finally slipped free. "I thought I was protecting you. All these years I thought I was doing the only thing I could. There was a time when hearing him say he was sorry would have undone me. Tonight, it didn't." I waited, arms at my sides, the marble floor cool through my heels. "Say what you need to say," I told him, and kept my voice even. "But don't rewrite history while you do it." He nodded quickly, as if grateful for any terms I would give him. "I watched what your mother became. I watched what I became beside her. You were 16 when I knew I couldn't stop her by standing in front of her. Every confrontation made her worse. Every time I defended you, she punished you harder when I wasn't there. I realized that if I fought loud, she would win loud. So I went quiet. I took meetings she didn't know about, signed papers she would never see, moved things where she couldn't reach them. I told myself I'd rather you hate me for my silence than see you destroyed by her rage." His voice wavered and then steadied. I told myself that a father could be a shield without being seen. I thought of the notarized documents, the slow, methodical transfers that had emerged from the investigator's folder like stepping stones leading out of a flood. I thought of birthdays that passed in silence, of dinners where he stared at his plate while my mother sharpened her insults on my bones. A shield doesn't watch the blows land and say nothing I said. A shield takes the strikes. He winced. I know what it looked like. God help me, I do. I stood there and let you believe I didn't love you because it kept her from looking too closely at what I was doing. When you turned 18 and she cut you off, His mouth trembled. I already had your name on the deeds. I needed time to make sure the filings would hold. I thought if I told you, you might look at me with hope, and she would see it in your eyes. She always knew where to look for leverage. I believed secrecy was the only way to keep you safe. Safe. The word felt heavy in my mouth. From hunger. From humiliation. From working 3 jobs while you watched, I kept my tone level because rage would have been a gift he didn't deserve. Protection without presence feels a lot like abandonment from the inside. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking. I deserve that, he whispered. I deserve worse. I should have found a way to protect you and hold you at the same time. I should have taken you out of that house. I should have told the truth to anyone who would listen. His eyes lifted to mine, red and pleading. But I was a coward who learned to be useful, not brave useful. I made myself small so she would not see the papers move. I let her spit her poison, and I absorbed it with silence because I thought the end would justify the means. He drew a ragged breath. It didn't. Not for you. The honesty in that last line landed where apologies never had. It did not erase a single night. It did not soften a single word my mother had hurled while he sat and stared at his fork. It simply told me he understood the cost he had chosen for me. You set a table I could sit at later, I said, and left me alone at the one we had. He nodded, tears slipping unchecked. I know. But I need you to know what I did too. The attorneys. The trust instruments. The signatures witnessed in towns she never thought to search. I documented everything. When you were 16, I made you co-owner without telling you, because if anything happened to me, I needed it all to default to you overnight. I kept copies hidden where she'd never look. I recorded her when she spoke too freely about the adoption. I kept ledgers of what she took, dates, amounts, who helped her move the funds. I built a trail for the day you would need it. He lifted a shaking hand, then let it fall. It wasn't love the way you deserved it, but it was love the way I knew how to do it without setting her on you like a dog. I studied him, the lines deeper at his eyes than they had been an hour ago, his spine bent under the weight of a choice he had carried for years. People drifted past at the corridor's mouth, casting those sidelong glances people cast when grief is private, but visible. Somewhere in the ballroom a glass broke, and laughter hiccuped and died in someone's throat. The world kept moving because it always does. Why now? I asked. Why wait until everything is ash and confession? He didn't flinch at the word. Because you made the ash, he said softly with something like awe. You did what I could not. You stood in the open and spoke it, and the world listened. I kept you alive for this moment, and then I kept you out of it. That is my sin. I am asking you to see the intention, even if you can't absolve the execution. I felt the old ache stir the child who had begged for a father's hand on her shoulder, the teenager who had wanted someone to tell her she wasn't crazy for seeing what she saw. That child deserved better. The woman I had become owed the child her loyalty before anyone else. I hear your intention, I said quietly, and I see the paperwork. Both can be true. You protected me on paper. You did not protect me at the table. His face folded and he reached for me, then stopped inches from my arm, as if the space between us had finally become a border he would not cross without permission. Please, he murmured. Tell me what I can do now. Tell me how to begin to make it right. I will testify. I will sign whatever you put in front of me. I will stand beside you when the authorities come. I will do anything. You will tell the truth, I said. To them, to yourself. You will stop calling silence protection when it was also convenience. You will stop asking me to compress 28 years of injury into one neat pardon. He closed his eyes and nodded. I can do that. When he opened them, the pleading had fallen away, and what remained was acceptance, raw and clean. If you never call me Dad again, I will live with that. If all I am to you is the man who moved the paperwork while you survived the fire, I will take it. I forfeited my claim the first time I watched her hurt you, and told myself the ledger would balance later. It doesn't. Not really. For a long moment we stood in the quiet, the ballroom's distant tide washing in and out of the corridor like a memory. He straightened a fraction as if surrender had given him some strange shape of dignity. You are everything I should have defended, he said. And you became it without me. The words were as close to grace as he would get from me tonight. I drew a breath that didn't tremble and let it out slow. There may come a day when I can forgive you, I said. But if it comes, it will not erase what happened. It will not rebuild what never existed. It will simply mean I have put down what I've carried. His lips parted as if to say thank you, but he only nodded, tears tracking clean lines through the ash of humiliation on his face. We turned together toward the light of the ballroom, not walking side by side, not yet, but no longer pretending to be strangers. Behind us, the corridor kept our words the way old houses keep drafts and secrets. Ahead, the guests shifted, the night waited, and justice kept its own slow time. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Emily slumped against the edge of the stage, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her phone. The room had quieted to an almost reverent hush, the weight of truth settling heavily over the wedding guests. I had taken a moment with my father, processed the gravity of his confession, and now I returned to the chaos of the main hall to witness the last desperate act of a woman cornered by the consequences of her own lies. Her eyes, wide and wild, darted to the large screens above the dance floor where images of the wedding could have been playing, and she muttered under her breath, shaking with panic and urgency. Her plan was obvious to me in that instant. She had been plotting a final counterstrike, a digital ambush to salvage some shred of control. Emily had begun recording herself on the phone, talking directly to the camera with a mixture of tears, venom, and hysteria. Her words were frantic, a tangled confession laced with accusations, a blend of truth and self-serving distortion. "I've lied," she whispered fiercely, voice shaking. "I've done things you all don't understand. I've had to keep my life perfect because if the world knew the truth about me, none of you would love me. None of you would respect me. And Katie?" She pointed her trembling finger toward me, her eyes blazing. "She's been jealous since we were children. She's always wanted to destroy me. But tonight I'll show you all. She's not the innocent one. She's manipulated everything." Her words spilled out faster like a dam breaking. She admitted the fabrications of degrees, the falsified job histories, the stolen money from her biological family, and even detailed her mother's complicity in orchestrating schemes to maintain the illusion of a flawless life. Every lie she had ever told, every deception she had relied upon to secure her place as the perfect daughter she confessed willingly with her phone, as both her weapon and her witness. What she hadn't planned, what she couldn't have foreseen in her frenzy, was the venue's automatic media system. Her trembling fingers, flustered and panicked, pressed the wrong button, and the small screen of her phone began casting live to the massive screens above the hall. Guests gasped collectively as Emily's own frantic, raw admission filled the room in bold, undeniable clarity. Every whispered lie, every calculated deceit, every twisted excuse, played across the screens, amplified by the speakers for everyone to hear. The murmurs began immediately rising like a tide as the crowd processed what they were seeing. The bride's frantic attempts to control the narrative had literally broadcast her guilt to the entire wedding party and all the guests. Her face turned from panic to horror as she realized the scale of her self-inflicted humiliation. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for a way to stop it, to erase it, to convince anyone that this wasn't real. But the digital evidence couldn't be undone. People recoiled, some stepping back, others leaning in closer, as if compelled to witness the unraveling of a life built entirely on deceit. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls, her face draining of the color she had clung to as a mask of composure. The whispers that had once speculated on who I truly was were now replaced with stunned acknowledgement of Emily's complete self-exposure. Each segment of the video confirmed every accusation I had made earlier, and then some her own words transforming her desperate act into incontrovertible proof against herself and her mother. I stood silently watching as the crowd's shock solidified into consensus. No one moved to defend her. No one attempted to argue her side. Even those who had long admired her, who had once celebrated her accomplishments, turned with cautious, disbelieving glances toward me. The justice that had been denied for so many years was now materializing not through confrontation, but through the sister's own compulsive admission. Every word she had intended to weaponize against me rebounded like a boomerang, destroying her credibility entirely. Emily's voice rose once more, shrill and frantic, as she tried to regain control. "No. Stop it. You don't understand. I didn't mean this isn't..." Her protests collapsed into nothing as her confession continued to play uninterrupted, the very act she hoped would humiliate me, instead delivering the final verdict on her deception. Her mother pressed her hands to her face, trying in vain to shield her from the spectacle, but it was too late. The evidence was public, undeniable, and irreversible. The guests murmured, some shaking their heads, some leaning forward in fascination, but none offered the comfort she had desperately sought. Every word she had spoken, meant to manipulate and intimidate, now cemented her disgrace. Her own actions had broadcast her crimes, her lies, her manipulations, and the betrayal of our family. For the first time in years, Emily was powerless in a way she could not recover from. I watched her slump forward onto the chair, her phone still live. Her voice reduced to whimpers as the crowd absorbed what had transpired. Her body quaked, shoulders hunched, utterly defeated by the evidence she had unwittingly provided. The irony was unbearable. Her last weapon intended to salvage her reputation and drag me down had instead become the instrument of her complete exposure. The truth had not come from me this time. It had come from her own hands, her own desperate choices, and the unintended consequences of technology she could not control. I stepped closer not to gloat, but to witness the final unraveling. "It's over, Emily," I said softly, my voice steady, each syllable carrying the weight of years of suppressed pain and victory. "Everything you tried to hide is out. Everything you wanted to manipulate is visible. And you did it yourself." Her eyes wide with disbelief, and tears flicked to me as though hoping for mercy, for an explanation, for some miracle that could rewind the moment. There was none. The evidence had already been broadcast. It had already been absorbed by every guest, every family member, every person present. The weight of her own confession hung over her like a gavel striking a courtroom, declaring her guilty beyond any possibility of denial. I could see the dawning realization in her expression, the final understanding that no amount of pleading, no frantic explanation, no attempt at spin could undo the damage. Every plan she had made, every manipulation she had executed to protect herself and attack me, had culminated in public exposure. The very confession meant to save her had destroyed her entirely. And the crowd, having absorbed the entirety of her own words, began to murmur not with curiosity or speculation, but with comprehension. The bride, the one who had once been the center of admiration, had rendered herself powerless. Every whisper of scandal, every look of doubt, every nod of recognition for truth's victory rippled through the room. Emily had transformed her desperation into the final proof of guilt, the ultimate self-incrimination. In that moment, the room seemed to pause, as if collectively acknowledging the magnitude of her undoing. My mother's grip on the chair beside her slackened. Guests leaned forward to see and hear, captivated by the spectacle she had unknowingly produced. And I, standing as the calm amidst the storm, realized that Emily's last desperate act had done what nothing else could. She had exposed herself fully, leaving no room for denial or distortion. She had just provided the evidence to convict herself. The murmurs that had begun as whispers after Emily's video confession grew into a steady hum of recognition, admiration, and disbelief. Every eye in the room followed me as I walked through the hall, my heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor, each step a statement of unspoken authority. Where once I had been invisible, a forgotten shadow in my own family's world, now I moved with a presence that demanded attention and respect. The guests shifted instinctively, creating a corridor for me without a word, as if some unspoken law had been rewritten in the silence following the confession. No one dared to challenge me. Not a hand raised, not a whisper questioning my claims, not a glance filled with the old doubt. The room was mine in that moment, the culmination of years of endurance strategy and quiet strength. People leaned closer to one another, sharing murmurs of admiration that carried through the air like a current. "She was right all along," someone whispered. "I can't believe what we've just seen," another voice added softly. "And the way she handled it, calm, controlled, undeniable." I kept my eyes forward, glancing only briefly at the crowd. Their approval did not need to be spoken to me directly. I could feel it in the air, a tangible shift in energy that replaced the tension of judgment with the weight of respect. My mother and Emily remained near the stage, slumped and broken, their faces a testament to a social power they had once commanded, but now completely lost. The hum of admiration for me served as a counterpoint to the humiliation that had enveloped them, leaving them vulnerable and utterly exposed. My mother's eyes met mine briefly, and I saw her old pride shattered, replaced by the desperate awareness that every whispered judgment she had ever leveraged against me was now rendered meaningless. Emily's shoulders trembled as she tried to regain composure, but the digital confession on the screens had permanently sealed her fate. There was no recovery, no mitigation, no argument to undo the revelation of her lies. Their social standing, once seemingly unassailable, had crumbled in full view of every guest, every family friend, every observer who had once looked up to them. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the shift in power settle into my body. The victory was mine both personally and publicly, and I had carried it not with anger but with a measured confidence that made the truth undeniable. Every insult, every slight, every dismissive glance I had endured over the years had been nothing more than preparation for this moment. Every moment of invisibility had taught me the value of patient strategy and calm precision. Now those lessons manifested in the eyes of the room in the way heads turned and whispers acknowledged the inevitability of the outcome. As I walked, I noticed how the guests' glances followed me not with the curiosity of the past, not with the shallow admiration once reserved for Emily, but with genuine recognition. They saw a woman who had survived ridicule, betrayal, and manipulation, only to emerge triumphant without resorting to spectacle or melodrama. My movements, deliberate and controlled, radiated a quiet power, the kind that did not shout for attention, but earned it naturally. The air around my mother and sister seemed heavier with each step I took away from them. I could see the realization dawning that their influence had evaporated, their carefully maintained veneer of superiority utterly exposed. For the first time in memory, the family that had tormented and belittled me found themselves powerless to alter perception or control the narrative. My social vindication was not just personal. It was a public acknowledgement of truth, of merit, and of the undeniable justice that had been absent for too long. I reached the edge of the hall where the grand double doors loomed, sunlight from the terrace spilling through in warm streams that illuminated the glittering guests. Each step toward the exit was deliberate, almost ceremonial, a physical representation of my journey from exclusion to acknowledgement. The whispers and murmurs of admiration followed me, echoing in the marble corridors like a chorus, confirming what had already been proven: I was no longer the marginalized daughter, the overlooked sibling, or the powerless woman in the shadows. I was the one who had outlasted deceit, who had transformed suffering into clarity, who had claimed not just justice, but recognition. As I approached the doors, I allowed myself a brief glance back. The ballroom had shifted into something new entirely. The social hierarchy once dominated by my mother's calculated dominance and Emily's curated image had been overturned. The witnesses, the friends, and even distant acquaintances who had never spoken a word in my favor now whispered, openly acknowledging my strength and the truth that could no longer be denied. I straightened my shoulders and let my gaze sweep over the room one final time. The air hummed with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and respect. My victory was complete. It was clear, undeniable, and shared by every eye in the hall. I had walked through years of humiliation, manipulation, and scorn, only to emerge with clarity and authority that no one could challenge. The power dynamic had reversed entirely. The oppressed had become the acknowledged, the ignored had become the center of attention, and the truth had finally set the record straight. Reaching the threshold of the doors, I felt the cool breeze of the terrace brush against my face, a reminder of the freedom and clarity that awaited beyond the ballroom. Each step forward was a statement of independence, a testament to resilience, and a symbol of the transformation from victim to victor. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every nod of recognition affirmed that justice had been served in the most public, undeniable way possible. And yet, as the doors loomed before me, promising the quiet and control of the world outside, a subtle shift in the air caught my attention. A presence lingered beyond the threshold, something I had not anticipated, something that had the potential to change the final rhythm of this night. I paused for the first time since leaving the chaos behind, aware that while the victory within the ballroom was complete, the world beyond its doors held possibilities that had not yet been revealed. But outside the door, an unexpected person was waiting for me. I stepped out onto the terrace, the cool night air brushing against my face, and froze. There, waiting beneath the soft glow of the terrace lights, was a figure I had only ever encountered in whispers and legend: William Harrison. The man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms I had never entered, whose decisions shaped entire industries, whose presence alone could make or break fortunes. And yet here he was, standing before me casually yet deliberately, as if the chaos of the wedding had been merely a prelude to this meeting. He smiled a calm, measured expression that carried decades of experience, and a sense of knowing that unsettled me in the most precise way. "Katie," he said, his voice deep and confident yet warm. "I've been watching you for quite some time, not from the shadows, not in secret, but observing the way you navigate life with intelligence, integrity, and courage. Everything tonight has confirmed what I already knew. You are remarkable in ways few realize." I blinked momentarily, speechless, my mind racing to reconcile the man before me with the stories I had heard growing up. "Mr. Harrison," I began cautiously. I don't know what to say." He raised a hand gently, halting any words. "You don't need to say anything. Tonight your actions spoke louder than any words could. You've demonstrated not only resilience but the ability to command respect and influence outcomes. I have always believed in recognizing talent when I see it, and tonight that belief is reinforced tenfold." I kept my distance, processing the enormity of the situation. All these years, the opportunities, the seemingly fortunate breaks, the untraceable support, it had all been part of a larger, carefully orchestrated pattern I had only partially understood. You knew about Andrew?" I asked finally, my voice trembling slightly. Harrison's eyes twinkled. "Of course. I have watched him grow much as I have watched you. His admiration for you is genuine, untainted by obligation or manipulation. His respect, his loyalty, his careful observations over the years, they have not gone unnoticed. That respect is real, Katie, and it mirrors my own assessment of your abilities." I felt a strange combination of relief and disbelief. Andrew had stood beside me tonight, unwavering, and now his father confirmed what I had known intuitively, the loyalty, the admiration, the quiet support. It was not born of fear or obligation, but of genuine recognition of my worth. Harrison took a measured step closer, his presence commanding yet unthreatening. "I want to offer you something that will solidify not just your personal accomplishments, but your professional legacy, a partnership in my company. Harrison Enterprises has grown to a scale that few imagine, but I need someone with your vision, your decisiveness, and your ethical clarity to help guide the next chapter. Together, we could reshape industries, influence markets, and set new standards for leadership. You would not merely participate. You would lead, shape, and command respect in ways the world will never forget." The magnitude of his offer settled over me like a tangible weight, equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. For decades, I had clawed my way up from obscurity, navigating obstacles that would have crushed the weak, enduring the constant shadow of my family's scorn. And now, the opportunity before me was immense, a validation of my talents, my perseverance, and the choices I had made, even when the world seemed against me. I don't know what to say," I repeated, though this time with a note of cautious hope rather than disbelief. "You don't need to say anything yet," Harrison replied, his voice steady. "Consider this an acknowledgement of your worth and a gesture of trust. I have always believed in fostering talent and integrity, and you embody both. Tonight you have shown that beyond doubt." I glanced back toward the terrace doors leading to the ballroom. The chaos inside had quieted into a hum of whispers, admiration, and disbelief. My family, my mother, my sister stood as specters of failure, their pride and illusion stripped away in a matter of hours. And outside in this quiet moment, the promise of something far greater awaited. The balance of power so long tilted against me had not just shifted, it had inverted entirely. Harrison's gaze softened as he observed me, weighing the enormity of the choice. "You've already proven your strength, your vision, and your ability to navigate the complexities of leadership and social influence. Accepting this partnership is not merely a reward, it's a recognition that your decisions, your strategy, and your character can alter the course of industries and inspire change on a massive scale." The wind carried the distant murmur of the guests, the faint echo of applause still lingering from the revelations inside. Every element of the evening, the confessions, the exposures, the public vindication had converged to create a moment of irreversible clarity. My family had lost everything they had assumed to control. My enemies had been humbled publicly. And now, a new chapter, unprecedented and immense, was being offered directly to me. I inhaled deeply, feeling the gravity of the offer settle in my chest. This was more than an opportunity. It was a tangible acknowledgement that all the sacrifices, all the struggles, all the calculated patience and strategic endurance had been worth it. I had turned years of pain and marginalization into something undeniable, and now the very architect of the fortune that had once seemed untouchable was offering me a partnership that would cement my legacy. Harrison inclined his head slightly, reading my expression as though he could anticipate every hesitation, every thought, every question. "Katie, your family's worst nightmare has come true. They have lost everything they assumed to control. And you, having endured every trial, having emerged with clarity and competence, now stand poised to gain more than they ever could have imagined. This is your moment, not just socially, not just personally, but professionally." I turned fully to face him, the enormity of the night crystallizing in my mind. Every betrayal I had endured, every slight, every injustice, had led to this vindication, exposure, and opportunity. I realized then that my journey was not only about revenge or justice. It was about stepping into a power that was rightfully mine, fully earned, fully recognized. Harrison extended a hand, and though the gesture was formal, it carried with it the weight of promise, trust, and acknowledgement. "The world awaits your next move," he said. "I've watched, I've waited, and now I believe it is time for you to take what you've earned and transform it into something extraordinary." I met his gaze, understanding fully the scope of what was being offered and the implications it carried. My family had collapsed in a matter of hours, my reputation restored and elevated. And now the very man who had facilitated so many of my earlier opportunities was offering me a partnership that would make me one of the most powerful women in the industry. The realization settled in thrilling and daunting. Every step I had taken tonight, from silence to confrontation, from exposure to vindication, had been a prelude to this. The room behind us, the guests, the hum of admiration and disbelief, they were witnesses to a transformation that had begun long ago and was now culminating in opportunity beyond measure. I extended my hand firm and unwavering, and he clasped it, sealing the promise, the recognition, and the beginning of a new chapter. My family's loss had become my gain, a tangible, undeniable shift that no power in the world could reverse. And yet, as I felt the weight of possibility settle around me, I knew that while tonight had proven my resilience and opened doors to unprecedented influence, the story was far from over. The game was far from over. I walked into the district attorney's office carrying a folder thicker than any I had ever dared to compile, the culmination of years of meticulous evidence gathering. Every ledger, every notarized document, every bank record, every forged signature, every fraudulent academic certificate, every illicit transfer, it was all here. Each sheet of paper, each file, each recorded conversation had been carefully organized to leave no room for doubt. I placed the folder on the polished oak desk and looked up at the assistant district attorney sitting across from me, a mixture of curiosity and awe flickering in her eyes. "This is everything I said," simply my voice steady, unwavering. "Every illegal act, every deceitful move, every crime my family has committed." The room went silent for a moment as she flipped through the first few pages, her eyebrows raising in astonishment. This is extensive," she murmured. "You've really documented everything." I nodded. "I've been preparing for this for years. Every transaction, every forged signature, every manipulated record, it's all here. The theft from my sister's biological inheritance, the false degrees, the fraudulent job claims, the embezzlement. Nothing is left out." As she continued leafing through the files, I recounted calmly and methodically how each piece of evidence connected, how the chain of fraud and deceit was unmistakable. She listened attentively, jotting notes occasionally, looking up with a mix of disbelief and respect. "You've been very thorough," she said, her tone soft but serious. "This will make a very strong case in court." With the evidence presented, the wheels of justice began to turn quickly. Warrants were issued, investigators were assigned, and soon my mother and sister were officially notified that they were facing criminal charges. The first charge against my mother was for the theft of my sister's biological inheritance, a betrayal that spanned years and involved multiple fraudulent transactions, all of which I had documented. She received a summons that for the first time in her life stripped her of authority, influence, and control. Emily, my sister, was charged for academic and professional fraud. Every degree she had claimed, every job title she had boasted about, every promotion she had flaunted as proof of her competence was now exposed as a lie with legal ramifications. The consequences were swift and undeniable. For the first time, both mother and daughter faced the consequences of their lifelong attempts to manipulate, deceive, and control through lies. As the investigation progressed, the public reaction mirrored what had occurred at the wedding. Friends, colleagues, and extended family members who had once supported them began to distance themselves, now aligned with the undeniable facts that could not be ignored. The social humiliation they had suffered at the wedding was now reinforced legally. Their social standing crumbled in concert with the exposure of their crimes. No longer were their lives merely shrouded in public whispers or hushed speculation. The law itself had now condemned their actions. The evidence, organized and irrefutable, left no room for defense. Every forged document, every illicit transaction, every fraudulent claim had been cataloged with precision. Investigators cross-referenced my files with independent bank audits, legal records, and professional credential checks, and every single piece of my evidence was confirmed as accurate. My family's lies were exposed not only socially, but legally, leaving them completely powerless and publicly accountable. I sat in the courtroom as the charges were read aloud, the room humming with quiet astonishment. The judge, composed and deliberate, laid out each accusation, detailing the years of deception, manipulation, and fraud. The courtroom audience listened intently, the weight of decades of lies falling heavily on the accused. My mother's eyes darted nervously, every gesture betraying panic. Emily, once confident and poised, now sat slumped in her chair, unable to meet anyone's gaze, the truth having stripped her of all pretense. When the prosecutors detailed the scope of my mother's embezzlement and theft, the room went still, the gravity of the crimes evident in the silence that followed. Each count was corroborated by the meticulous documentation I had prepared, leaving no doubt as to her culpability. Emily's fraudulent achievements were similarly dismantled, her credentials exposed as falsified. Her professional claims invalidated, her career prospects shattered by the revelation of her own deceit. I watched quietly as the legal process unfolded, observing the transformation of my family from figures of perceived power to subjects of accountability. Their loss was complete and unequivocal. Everything they had built on deception, prestige, influence, and financial manipulation was now dismantled under the authority of law. The court proceedings did not rely on whispers or social perception. They relied on the undeniable truth supported by documentation, witnesses, and irrefutable facts. As I left the courtroom that day, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. The weight of vindication was profound, not just because of personal closure, but because the mechanisms of justice had finally aligned with the truth. I had spent years meticulously gathering evidence, enduring humiliation, and navigating complex family dynamics, all with the aim of ensuring that the law recognized what social observation had already confirmed, that deceit and manipulation cannot endure when exposed to scrutiny and accountability. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight reflected off the marble steps, casting long, clear shadows that seemed to parallel the clarity that had now been established. Guests, friends, and strangers who had witnessed the public unfolding of events looked on with admiration and, in some cases, disbelief. The full measure of justice had been realized, not merely social or reputational, but legal and absolute. My family, once untouchable in their arrogance and manipulation, had been brought low, stripped of their authority, and forced to confront the consequences of their actions in the most unassailable forum imaginable. Every step I took down the courthouse steps felt deliberate, self-assured, a testament to years of endurance and meticulous preparation. The social and legal systems had both recognized the truth of my experiences and the integrity of my actions. The humiliation and destruction my mother and sister had attempted to wield against me had backfired entirely, leaving them powerless and accountable. Finally, as the courthouse doors closed behind me and I stood in the open air, I felt the profound sense of closure that comes when the law has affirmed the truth. The years of careful planning, patient documentation, and courageous confrontation had led to this moment. Every lie, every theft, every act of fraud had been exposed, addressed, and rectified through the mechanisms of justice. Justice was finally being served. The courthouse steps were still warm beneath my feet when I realized the story no longer belonged to my past. The charges were filed. The evidence accepted the machinery of the law, now grinding forward with a certainty I didn't have to push anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next blow. I stood at the bottom of those marble stairs and felt something I had never allowed myself to trust: open space ahead of me. It wasn't triumph that filled that space, it was responsibility. The crowd outside had already begun dispersing, reporters dialing numbers, onlookers drifting away with a sense that they had seen the end of one chapter. I knew better. Ends, if they were true endings, always made room for beginnings. In the days that followed, the practical pieces moved quickly. Attorneys finalized statements. Harrison Enterprises issued a brief acknowledgement of my partnership and my new role in the company's next phase. The press tried to call it a saga, a scandal, a takedown. But the headline I wanted most wasn't about the wreckage behind me, it was about what I intended to build. So I wrote my own. I drafted the announcement at my kitchen table in the quiet hours before dawn, the kind of letter you only get to write once. I explained that I was establishing the Second Light Foundation, named for the hour before sunrise, when the world softens and the future can be seen through quieter eyes. Its mission would be simple and relentless: to identify and support children who had been abandoned emotionally or materially with legal advocacy scholarships, mentorship, and emergency housing. I knew those needs intimately. I knew what it meant to hold a bus pass in one hand and an empty refrigerator in the other. I knew what it meant to sit alone in a house filled with people and wonder where my place would ever be. The announcement went out on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by our first commitments: a 5-year endowment to fund legal services for guardianship disputes and adoptions handled with integrity, a scholarship program for first-generation college students who were working while attending school, a network of volunteer mentors recruited from every division of Harrison Enterprises to offer practical training in resume writing, interviewing, financial literacy, and basic rights. We would staff a hotline for teenagers who had aged out of their homes but not yet into their lives. We would offer microgrants for emergencies that topple young people who don't have a couch to sleep on or a safe adult to call. I wasn't interested in charity as performance. I wanted systems, scaffolding, the kind of help that keeps people from falling, and the kind that lifts them when they already have. The response was immediate. Within hours, messages poured in, stories from women and men who had been quiet for decades about childhoods that left them flinching at holidays, letters from teachers who kept granola bars in desk drawers for the student who always came to class, hungry calls from social workers who had learned to do more with less and wanted to do more with more. A retired judge offered to consult on policy. A chef volunteered to run weekend classes for teens who needed employable kitchen skills fast. A landlord pledged a set-aside of low-cost rooms with safe leases for youth in crisis. The world, which had felt like a wall for so long, revealed itself as a corridor. I held the first public gathering in a community center that smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. There were folding chairs and uneven microphones, and no glamour, and it was perfect. I spoke plainly. I told them that pain refined me, but had never been my purpose. I told them that survival had taught me the difference between spectacle and substance. I promised that the foundation would measure success by the weight lifted off real shoulders, not by the weight of press clippings. I meant every word, and I could feel the room believe me. When the meeting ended and the crowd thinned, I sensed him before I saw him. Andrew waited near the back, hands in his pockets, posture unassuming in a way that told me he had rehearsed being smaller than his name required. We hadn't spoken since the courthouse. There was nothing unfinished between us, only a quiet pause where shock had lived. He stepped closer, not too close, and his voice carried the respectful steadiness I had first recognized in conference rooms. "I don't want to take your time," he said, "but I don't want to miss the chance to say this either." I waited, and he offered a quick, rueful smile. "What I admire about you has nothing to do with what you won or what I lost, and everything to do with how you stood in the middle of a storm and refused to become it. I can't change where I came from. I can change who I am in front of you." He glanced at the door, then back to me. "I don't want to pass because of my father, or a place because of the company. I want the chance to earn your trust the way anyone would, honestly, slowly, and on your terms. If that chance is impossible, I'll accept it and step back. If there's a road, I'll walk it. There's an honesty that lives in restraint. The younger version of me might have needed grand gestures or declarations to feel safe. The woman I had become stood on different ground. I don't hand out positions, I said, soft and sure. But I recognize applicants with potential." He exhaled relief tempered by understanding. "Then I'll apply," he said. "Every day without assumption. We didn't touch. We didn't promise. We set something truer than both in the space between us, a standard. He knew what it meant to follow one, and so did I. Whatever grew there would be measured by merit and trust, not by proximity to power or the convenience of a last name. For the first time, it felt imaginable, not just a partnership in business, but a possibility in life that didn't require me to translate or shrink. Work began in earnest. My days took on the steady rhythm of purpose foundation briefings at dawn, strategy calls mid-morning, on-site visits to shelters and schools in the afternoon, board meetings at night, where decisions were made with timelines and budgets instead of emotions masquerading as urgency. We hired a small team with large minds, a former foster youth turned attorney to lead legal services, a nurse practitioner to manage health partnerships, a data analyst who had once slept in her car and now built dashboards to track outcomes. We set clear goals: retention rates for scholarship recipients, job placements within 90 days for trainees, a reduction in emergency housing gaps measured month by month. Nothing was left to inspiration alone. We were building an instrument tuned to people. And still there were quiet moments. A girl in a faded hoodie hugging a new set of house keys like a trophy. A boy who texted a photo of his first pay stub to the hotline at midnight because there was no one else he wanted to tell. A grandmother who rested her head on my shoulder and cried because she no longer had to choose between an inhaler and the electric bill for the grandson sleeping down the hall. In those moments, the past did not disappear. It simply took its seat, acknowledged, no longer dictating the tempo. Not everyone approved of the way I moved forward. A columnist wrote that I had turned vengeance into philanthropy as a rebrand. Another opined that I would vanish once the headlines cooled. I did not answer them. The answer would be numbers and stories that continued after the ink dried. Revenge. I learned is loud and brief. Repair is quiet and persistent. I chose repair. William Harrison called one evening as I walked home, the city glinting in that thin sliver of blue between daylight and night. "You sound tired," he said, amused and approving. "Good leaders should now and then. Good leaders delegate." I returned, and he laughed, warm and unguarded. "We're working on it," he said. "I'm proud of you." I thanked him, meaning it in a way that surprised me. Gratitude didn't erase autonomy. It affirmed it. He did not treat my foundation like an accessory to our partnership. He treated it like an engine. He introduced me to people who spoke the language of capital without making it a god. The partnership we had formed was not a scaffold for vanity projects, it was a conduit for scale. As months passed, the social maps redrew themselves. Doors that had once been closed to me opened, not because of vengeance, but because my work required entry. People who had avoided me at parties asked for meetings not to gossip but to contribute meaningfully. My name, which had been shaped by others for so long, finally fit in my own mouth the way a true name should mine and no one else's. One evening I stood in the community center again, the same room where we had begun. Though the walls were brighter now, the bulletin board crowded with job postings and scholarship photos, and the scribbles of a tutoring schedule drawn up in cheerful marker. The staff had stayed late to celebrate our first 100 scholarships funded and our first dozen apartments secured. Someone put a cupcake with a candle in my hand and told me to make a wish. I didn't need to. Wishes were for what you cannot reach. Plans are for what you will. When the lights dimmed and the laughter stretched thin with fatigue, I lingered alone a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the building. I thought of a girl at a corner table in a ballroom, the kind of girl who learned to leave before the cake was served because the cake was never meant for her. I thought of the woman who walked through that same room and across a set of marble steps into daylight. I thought of the lives we had already touched and the ones we hadn't met yet. It was not a fairy tale, not a victory lap, not a neat circle closing. It was a line pushing forward. I locked the door behind me and stepped into the night shoulders. Loose breath, even the streetlights gilding the sidewalks like a promise kept. The city was loud and alive, but inside me there was a steady, quiet place that hadn't existed before, a place built from truth, merit, and relationships chosen for their honesty and their capacity to bear weight. And that was the day I stopped being the unwanted child forever. A year after I locked the community center and stepped into the night, certain of who I'd become, the city looks different to me, not because its skyline changed, but because the map inside my chest finally did. The morning light finds me at my office window most days. Coffee cooling on the sill while I read updates from the Second Light Foundation and Harrison Enterprises in tandem, two engines humming in the same machine. I used to measure time by what I was surviving. Now, I measure it by who is crossing finish lines that once felt impossible. And that was the day I stopped being the unwanted child forever I wrote in my journal 12 months ago. I didn't know then how quickly a new life could accumulate around those words, quietly, steadily, and with a kind of grace I hadn't dared to expect. Second Light has grown from promise to practice. We set a modest target in year 1 and doubled it by spring. Dozens of young people, kids who were sleeping in cars on friends' couches or in the corners of loud houses, are now holding dorm keys and pay stubs and acceptance letters. Mariah, who used to skip class to work the morning shift at a diner, sent me a photo of her nursing student badge lanyard crooked and smile enormous. Dev, who once texted our hotline at 2 a.m. from a bus stop, now wears a hard hat and finishes his apprenticeship next month. He mailed us the first rent receipt he ever paid with his own signature across the bottom. We launched an emergency microgrant program for teens who need something as simple as a birth certificate fee, or a tire repair, the tiny catastrophes that derail lives without anyone noticing. Our legal team cleared backlogs of guardianship cases and forced 3 predatory landlords to obey the law. We built a mentorship pipeline with paid hours, not exposure, because electricity and groceries don't accept exposure as currency. At Harrison Enterprises, the reforms we imagined on that terrace with William became policy. We published a supplier transparency report and enforced it without blinking. We tied executive bonuses to ethical compliance metrics and workforce development outcomes, not just quarterly profit. We opened a training campus 2 blocks from the foundation and braided the 2 worlds together. When our scholars finish classes in the afternoon, they walk 3 minutes to paid internships that teach them real skills: coding sprints, bookkeeping, OSHA certs, commercial kitchen training. No handshakes without ladders attached. Some days I sit in on the sessions and say almost nothing. Watching people become themselves is a kind of music that doesn't need accompaniment. My marriage to Andrew began quietly with vows exchanged in a garden behind the courthouse that smells of wisteria in late spring. No chandeliers, no speeches, no audience except the two witnesses required, and William standing back a respectful distance with a smile he tried and failed to hide. Andrew and I agreed that what mattered wasn't the spectacle, but the practiced daily ordinary choices aligned with the values we swore to defend. We kept our names in the places where they belonged, and shared one where it felt right. At work, we are merciless about conflict of interest protocols. He still calls me boss when we step into the boardroom, and I still roll my eyes, but we both know the respect inside the joke is real. At home, he cooks on Thursdays, I cook on Sundays, and we keep a ceramic dish by the door for handwritten notes, a habit that began the night he asked if he could earn my trust and never stopped being necessary. We don't promise perfection, we promise repair. Consequences settled around my family like winter snow, quiet, unavoidable, revealing what held warmth and what did not. My mother rents a small apartment above a laundromat now. The first time I saw her there, she was returning a grocery cart to the corral in the parking lot, coat zipped to the throat, hair unstyled, cheeks bare of the armor she once wore. She works mornings at a thrift store and evenings preparing trays at a church kitchen where no one knows her last name. Some days, she looks brittle with resentment. Other days, she looks simply tired. I do not interfere. The courts required restitution and community service. Compliance reports arrive on schedule. When I think of her, I try to think of the casseroles she serves to strangers without asking how they came to need them. Learning the value of honest work is slower than any sentence a judge can hand down. She shows up. That is new. Emily cleans rooms at a mid-range hotel off the freeway and takes night classes at the community college nearby. She has not asked me for help, and I have not offered. The school registrar would not accept anything but verified transcripts. It startled her at first, and then steadied her. Last month, she wrote a short essay for an adult learner scholarship about telling the truth after a lifetime of pretending. I read it because the scholarship committee asked for blind reviews, and the voice was unmistakable. I held my breath through the last paragraph. She didn't make excuses. She didn't mention me. She wrote about making a bed properly for the first time in her life, smoothing the corners, tucking the sheet with the same care no matter who would sleep there next. Humility has a texture. It feels like cotton pulled tight, no wrinkles to hide beneath. My father arrives on Saturdays at 8, never later and rarely earlier. He brings coffee from the shop 3 blocks away and never forgets to ask how I take it 1 sugar splash of cream. He volunteers with our legal team, sorting scanned documents and runs errands. No one else wants hauling file boxes, returning borrowed wheelchairs, sitting in county offices to retrieve records that require patience and a straight back. He keeps a small spiral notebook in his pocket where he writes tasks down, and he marks them off with a single line so he can still read what they were later. We don't talk much about the past. He shows me his day's list before he leaves and sometimes asks if he can take on more tomorrow. He has learned that words are least useful when they try to replace deeds. Each week is a stitch. The fabric isn't pretty yet, but it holds. The empire we are building, if that's the word anyone insists on using, does not look like towers and black cars to me. It looks like pay equity audits that change checks on Friday and procurement bids awarded to small firms that meet standards larger companies dismiss as too much trouble. It looks like a supply chain that refuses to squeeze people thin and calls that efficiency. It looks like saying no to a lucrative contract because the other party treats safety as optional and ethics as a press release. Last quarter, we walked away from a deal worth more than I earned in my first 5 years combined. Our stock dipped for a week and then recovered when customers who notice more than marketing decided they trusted us. Integrity is not a halo, it's a lever. We mark our milestones quietly. When the 100th Second Light Scholar crossed a stage this spring, we didn't rent a ballroom. We held an afternoon picnic in the park with paper plates and a live band that played Motown and teenagers' requests in equal measure. William danced awkwardly with a girl who plans to be an engineer and with a boy who wants to be a nurse because his grandmother raised him and he knows what steady hands can do. Andrew grilled until his shirt smelled like charcoal and onions, and I sat on a blanket with 6 mothers who asked if our financial literacy class could meet later on Thursdays because the bus schedule changed. I wrote it down and we moved it the next week. That's the thing about power: when it finally belongs to you, you can spend it on other people without losing any. There are still days when memory ambushes me: a scrap of music from a wedding band, the clink of glass on porcelain, the rustle of satin behind a door I wasn't meant to open. I don't push those moments away. I set them beside the new ones and let them be what they are, facts in a larger ledger that no longer determines my future. When a case comes across my desk that looks too much like the girl I used to be, I step out of meetings and into hallways because sometimes the only ethical response is to make a call yourself. Hi, I say I'm from Second Light. Tell me where you are and we'll come get you. We always do. At home, the ceramic dish by the door keeps filling. Andrew's notes are never grand, just true. You were right about hiring Marisol. The basil is thriving. I'll be at the campus at 6, want to meet for tacos. Sometimes I find one that says only proud of you, and I pin it to the corkboard in the kitchen between a photograph of our staff and a list of scholarship deadlines. On our first anniversary, he gave me a frame with a print of a simple line, straight and unbroken. The year we kept our promise to the work he said. I kissed him and thought, yes, that's the shape of happiness when you stop measuring it against anyone else's gaze. If you had told the girl at the corner table that a year could hold this much repair, she would have laughed at you or cried. I do neither. I pay invoices on time, I keep my staff fed during late meetings. I return calls when I say I will, and I write thank you notes in ink because some things should be permanent and personal. The world is still the world. Grief doesn't evaporate just because justice finally found its way to the door. But when I walk into a room now, any room, I carry the knowledge that I belong there because of what I build in it, not because anyone else grants permission. One afternoon in early summer, we opened the door of our 12th apartment to a brother and sister who had spent a year surviving in the corners of other people's homes. The girl traced the edge of the kitchen counter with her finger, as if she were reading Braille, and the boy opened every cabinet and laughed because each one held something useful. When they turned to me, I handed them a key on a blue lanyard and said the line. I wish someone had said to me a long time ago, "This is yours. You are safe here. The future isn't a trick." The door closed softly behind them, and I stood in the hall for a moment listening to the sounds of a life beginning where a story almost ended. I thought of my mother counting hangers at the thrift store, of my sister smoothing a pillowcase that will be slept on by a stranger, of my father's small notebook with its patient lines. I thought of William's trust, of Andrew's steady hand, of the dozens of young people who now sign their names to documents that tell the truth about who they are and what they will become. Sometimes the best revenge is living well and helping others do the same. Thank you for staying with me through this journey from the corner table to a life built on truth, merit, and quiet strength. If the story moved you, I'd love to have you with me for what comes next. So subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to never miss a new chapter of drama, redemption, and real-world justice. Your voice matters here. Tell me in the comments. Which moment hit you hardest? The groom's public stand, the mother's unraveling the inheritance reveal, or the night the confession lit up the screens? And why? Do you believe forgiveness without forgetting is possible? And where would you have drawn the line if you were in my shoes? Share the twist you didn't see coming, the character you most empathized with, and the lesson you'd pass on to someone fighting their own quiet battle. If you want more stories where truth dismantles power and second chances turn into new beginnings, say so and suggest the next theme you want explored. Complicated families, workplace reckonings, hidden benefactors, or legal justice done right. Finally, if this story reminded you that healing beats humiliation and building beats bragging, please like the video and share it with a friend who needs proof that strength can be soft and still win. Your comments, questions, and theories keep this community alive, and I'll be reading and responding because the conversation doesn't end here. It's only beginning.